We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! This is Uruzi and this is part 5 of What If Naruto Conquers His Inner Demons. When Utakata discovers that Yagura is being manipulated by Akatsuki, he flees the hidden mist with the goal to save himself and his only friend. His solution? Find the other Jinchūriki and convince them to join his fight. But the Jinchūriki have more baggage than just the Bijū they contain, and if they can't create a cohesive unit from broken recluses, they may all be dead. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 11, The Tanuki's Value. You will be attending the Chunin exams being held in Konoha next week. Gaara stared at his father, expression implacable. Beside him, but still several feet away, his older sister Temari and older brother Kankuro exchanged brief glances. For what purpose? Temari asked. When the Kazekage's eyes, black, analytical, piercing, shifted to her, she added with exaggerated politeness, Kazekage-sama. The leader of the hidden sand village let out a curt "Hm." We have fallen out of favor with the daimyo and are suffering for it. Where Sunagakure was once a thriving, representative metropolis of the 5 great shinobi nations, we are now in decline. An opportunity has presented itself for us to re-establish our legacy, and it begins with infiltrating the Chunin exams. What do you wish us to do? Kankuro asked. His father's gaze swiveled to him, and he swallowed and added, Kazekage-sama, you only need to pass. Do you think you can manage that? He posed, a bite of condescension in his voice. Gaara became the sole target of his father's stare as his siblings murmured their assent. Teal eyes met black, no shred of emotion reflected in either pair. After several moments of unyielding silence, the Kazekage stated coolly, you will be required to obey this directive, Gaara. I will not ask again. I will go. Suna's leader stared at him, but Gaara did not yield like his siblings, refusing to tack on the man's title. He'd long ago lost the capacity to fear his father, to feel anything, really, in the explosion that had taken Yashimaru's life. Every successive assassination attempt had only further dulled those feelings. Eventually, the older man gave up on trying to silently pressure his youngest's subservience, offering a thin-lipped smile to his children. It didn't reach his eyes. With this mission, you will finally prove your worth to Sunagakure. Dark eyes flicked over to the redhead. Especially you, Gaara. Your purpose will finally be fulfilled. For once in his life, Gaara spent most of the night staring at something other than the moon above him. Instead, his gaze remained on the small gemstone Rashi had given him, a garnet, the Iwa had called it, allowing the moonlight to glimmer along its scarlet surface, feeling its sharp edges with hands unused to the sensation of touch. Rashi had said the color was like his hair, but the Sunanin was reminded more of blood, freshly spilt, seeping through the porous makeup of his sand and saturating the silica in his gourd, of the red rivulets that had run down his own chest from where Uchiha Sasuke had injured him, hurting him in a way no one else ever had. Vaguely, the Sunanin became aware of the lightning sky around him as night changed to dawn. When he was young, Yashimaru would sometimes join him on the roof of their home and comment on the beauty of the sunrise over the hidden sand village. He hadn't understood at the time, and no one else had been able to teach him after his uncle's failed assassination cum suicide, so over the years, each new sunrise had just become the announcement of another day in which he would try to prove his existence. Now he wondered if he'd been wrong to dismiss his uncle's words, as wrong as his views on how to be strong. Fu! Just wait, please. Gaara looked down to spy to a dark-haired figure dressed in light blue catch up to a slight person with mint-green hair who stood in the middle of the courtyard. When they were next to each other, they began conversing too quietly for the redhead to hear. Fu eventually shouted, they've already judged us, Su. Her head swiveled suddenly to meet Gaara's teal eyes, and he couldn't decipher the full tumult of emotions in her gaze, though anger was clear. Naruto's face had looked similar whenever he'd started arguing against Gaara's worldview on their mission, and the redhead had eventually connected the emotion to the facial expression. The figure beside Fu noticed that she was no longer paying attention, and a second gaze looked up to find Gaara staring back. With her companion's attention gone, the green-haired girl dashed away, fleeing for refuge in a separate part of the compound. By the time the blue-clad person noticed, Fu was long gone. Instead of giving chase, the dark-haired figure jumped up to the roof, mimicking the same motions Rashi had taken the night before. Gaara turned to face his new companion, though he remained silent, allowing the male brunette to make the first move. A single golden eye scrutinized the redhead from head to toe, momentarily pausing on the hideate tied wrapped around the belt holding his gourd on his back. "You're Gaara, right? The Ichibi Jin container. Ichin. Sorry, I don't really know anything about you aside from your name and your status. Status? You know, being a Jinchūriki," he whispered. Gaara stared silently at him, and the brunette elaborated, "Fu doesn't react well to hearing what we are, so I'm trying to stop saying it. That term, Jinchūriki, it's not wrong necessarily, but it could be construed as offensive. We've been hurt enough by others that engaging in self-harm isn't exactly constructive. Self-harm, you know, hurting ourselves. Just because others have poor opinions of us doesn't mean that we should sustain their beliefs." Gaara continued to stare at the other male, expression blank. "You are very different from Rashi," he decided. The brunette grinned a little. "Is that a bad thing? I think that's better than the alternative. I'm Utakata, by the way. You are Naruto's other friend. Is that what he told you?" Gaara thought the older boy looked happy. "Yes, that's good." He fell silent, seemingly unsure of what to say next. Gaara turned away from him and looked over the ground below, absently scanning the area for Fu. He was almost curious how she had known where he was when he'd done nothing to give himself away. The villagers of the hidden sand had always been more interested in staying away from him than seeking him out, and to find someone who searched for him was unusual. Naruto had been the first in quite a long time. "So I guess you and Naruto are friends, too, huh?" Gaara turned back to the brunette, blinked once, and then turned away again. No. That sounded like surprise. "Then, why are you here?" "I failed to kill him. Jiraiya freed me from prison. We found Tsunade and then returned here." "That's, I'm not sure I understand. Could you maybe provide a little more detail?" "Yo, kid." Jiraiya was standing below them, looking spreer than his 5 decades would suggest, and was cheerily waving one hand up at the two of them. "Come on down, we've got things to discuss." "Sure," Utakata replied. "Give me." No, not you. I want Gaara." "Oh." Again, there was a note of what the redhead guessed to be surprise in the brunette's voice. "I guess I'll just leave you to it then." Gaara ignored the older Jinchūriki, instead rising to his feet and jumping down to the courtyard, maintaining a healthy distance from Jiraiya. The Sannin motioned with his head to the inside of the complex, and Gaara followed him, their steps unhurried. He was led into a room lined with filled bookshelves, a large wooden table set at its center. Tsunade stood next to the table. Rashi was tucked into one corner of the room, arms folded over his chest. Jiraiya walked over to the Hokage and motioned to the lone piece of furniture. "All right, kid, it's your turn," he said. "Hop on up." Gaara obeyed with meticulous slowness, liberating himself from both the white sash and tan belt that crossed his body in an X from shoulder to hip, the gourd he carried on his back falling with the belt. His posture straightened at the sudden loss of weight, and the redhead found himself fixated by the discarded objects with an unknown feeling. He'd carried the burden of his gourd for so long, using the sand within, mother's sand, to prove his existence, that to willingly divest himself of it was strange. But if he was trying to be stronger than the person he was before he'd met Naruto, maybe it was better this way. "Gaara." The redhead looked up to find both Sannin looking at him, Jiraiya's expression more concerned than the blonde's. Tone cautious, the older man probed, "Everything okay?" "Yes." He hoisted himself onto the table, laying supine at Tsunade's direction. All was quiet as she ran hands glowing with green chakra over him. From his periphery, he could see Jiraiya scribbling ink on the walls in patterns beyond the Tsunanin's comprehension. Eventually, the older man put away his writing instruments and held his hand up to the squiggles. The markings spread along the walls, ceiling, and floor at his touch, forming an interconnected matrix of glowing blue glyphs throughout the room. "Well, there's nothing physically wrong with him," Tsunade eventually announced. The sound of shuffling papers made its way to Gaara's ears, and he returned his attention to the female Sannin. "These reports say he's never been injured on a mission, and he's apparently completed a B-rank solo, so I guess that makes sense." "Sounds like a Jinchūriki to me," Rashi commented dryly. "Hm. I'm more concerned about this psych evaluation that was done while we had him incarcerated." Narcissistic, socio- and psychopathic tendencies, bloodthirsty, not to mention a political prisoner of war. Geez, Jiraiya, why the hell would you ever vouch for him? Because if Naruto had been in the room, he would've. But Brat ain't sharpest rock. You didn't see them together when we were searching for Tsunade, Jiraiya rebutted. Gaara's learning to be normal. Jinchūriki ain't normal. Rashi argued. I already regret this, Tsunade muttered. Louder, she announced, okay, enough. I have actual responsibilities to get to, and we're here for a reason. Ah, right. Good point, Haim. Jiraiya approached the table and stood directly in Gaara's field of vision. Gaara, I'm going to check your seal now. I assumed, the Sunanin intoned. Yes, well, this is not going to be as easy as Tsunade's evaluation just was. See, when I stopped you before, I applied a Gojyo Fuin. That is why I lack power. It is a nifty little trick, Jiraiya said, sounding pleased with himself. More soberly, he continued, the problem is, I can't properly check your seal without removing the Gojyo Fuin. And that'll probably hurt. Hurt? Gaara repeated, testing the word. I will be in pain. Naruto had said he would be able to heal the pain the Sunanin felt, yet now he was being told he would have to endure more. Jiraiya looked sad. Unfortunately, yes. Given your history, we're taking precautions, but we don't know what to expect once I undo the seal. Can't say I've ever had to use this trick on a Jinchūriki before. The redhead was quiet for a long moment, musing over what the Sannin had told him. Very well. Okay, Jiraiya agreed. He nodded to Rashi, who approached the table, and to Tsunade, who stood near the boy's feet. The Iwanin twisted his fingers through seals, and lava bubbled to life within his palms. He approached the younger redhead's left side, cupping his hands over his wrist until a band of shiny black obsidian strapped the limb to the table. He repeated that for the sand shinobi's other wrist and both ankles, flat teal eyes watching his every movement. When all four limbs were restrained, Rashi moved to stand opposite Jiraiya, molten globules no bigger than an apple in each hand. He nodded at the Sannin. Jiraiya rubbed his hands together. Alright, kid, we're about to get started. Friendly reminder, this will probably hurt. A lot. But we're on your side, and we're doing this to make sure you're okay. Okay, yes, alright then. The fingertips of his right hand glowed blue with chakra. Gaara could barely make out kanji within each chakra flame before the white-haired man plunged his hand into the boy's stomach. Power flooded Gaara's veins as the five-element seal came undone, and for a second, he remembered what it felt like to be strong. Then the strength morphed into something ugly, and Gaara screamed, a high-pitched, ear-piercing howl. Streams of sand rose from his body, his armor of sand cracking and becoming patchwork as it was used to create the fine tendrils of silica. Rashi, I see, pain. It was like Uchiha Sasuke had shoved his lightning-covered fist into every cell of his body, but this time there was no entry wound, no blood, just an unending agony that was magnitudes worse than anything he'd felt before. He shouted for mother, trying to find a tether of familiarity to cling to. Let me out, free me. Mother was shrieking, a white-hot knife stabbing repeatedly into his brain and setting his ears ringing. He screamed again, louder, longer, but it still couldn't drown out the sound of mother's unceasing wails for freedom, for blood, for mayhem. Gojyo Fuin. Gaara gasped soundlessly when a weight struck his stomach, voice depleted from screaming. Teal eyes opened wide and his body jackknifed upright, stopped by the restraints around his wrists and ankles. Splayed around him like deformed sentinels were spindly towers of dark rock. He tried to ask about them, but the only thing to escape his throat was a raw, raspy exhale. I wouldn't try talking just yet, Jiraiya advised. You've got nothing left in the tank. Rashi, can you know, he gestured towards the Sunanin. If that's what you want. The Iwanin walked around the table, placing his hands upon each restraint and forcing them to crumble with a quick application of chakra. When Gaara's hands were free, he took the glass of water Tsunade offered him and drank from it in small sips. When the blonde Sannin held a hand glowing with medical chakra up to his throat, he jerked away, spilling several drops of liquid onto his hand. I'm not going to hurt you, Tsunade said, sounding annoyed. But her words were also gentle, like Yashimara had been before, I'm trying to help. Naruto's eager visage flashed in his mind's eye, the blonde's reassurance that people would help him echoing where mother's shrieks had left a cavernous silence. He made a noise of consent, and Tsunade proceeded to raise her hand to his throat, soothing the raw feeling within. When it felt like he could finally speak, he croaked a raspy, unsure, "Thank you, humph." She turned to Jiraiya, hands fisted on her hips. "Hope you got what you needed. That's an hour of my life I'd rather not relive." "Yeah, think that was bad, try fightin' Ichibi. By definition what we're currently trying to prevent," Tsunade deadpanned. Jiraiya? The white-haired man exhaled a heavy sigh. "Well, the good news is, I got a good enough look at the seal that we don't have to do this again." Tsunade arched an eyebrow. "And the bad news?" Gaara observed both Sannin, expression unreadable. It appeared to be mirrored in the faces of those who were evaluating him, though it might have been that the only thing making them unreadable was his inability to perceive their thoughts. Tsunade looked stern, and Jiraiya appeared thoughtful. Or maybe sad. He angled his head to look at Rashi, standing to his left, but the older redhead offered no further insight, his brow furrowed in deep scowl. Jiraiya coughed. "Well, that's complicated. The seal is stable-ish. Stable-ish?" Tsunade repeated through clenched teeth. "That's not a thing. We don't classify patients as stable-ish, they're either stable or critical, so which is it?" "I'm sorry, but in this case it's stable-ish," Jiraiya insisted. His teammate opened her mouth to protest, but he quickly cut across her, saying, "Just give me a chance to explain, Heim. By all accounts, his seal appears to be working as intended. Keep in mind, Fuinjutsu is not a universal art, so each village has its own style, let's say, and I'm not exactly an expert on every variation." "Yeah, looked over my seal," Rashi noted. "There aren't too many seals that can contain a Bijū," Jiraiya explained. "Only a handful of arrays can handle that much chakra, especially from back in the days when you were sealed. If I'm being honest, I'm doing some guesswork based on what I know of how seals are supposed to overlay and interact. Gaara's seal has some more modern elements, which is helpful, but the design is strange. Actually, when I was examining it, I was reminded a little of when Sensei had us dissect those puppets during the war, figure out how they ticked, remember, Heim? How could I forget?" Tsunade grumbled. "Chiyo and her damn poisons made my life a living hell." "So you're saying, what, Gaara's a puppet?" "Ha!" Rashi scoffed. "Ain't that truth?" Both Sannin shot the Iwanin a displeased side-eye before Jiraiya elaborated. "Obviously it's a bit more complicated than that, but otherwise, yeah, you could probably say that. For all intents and purposes, a Jinchūriki is basically a human storage scroll for an unfathomable amount of chakra, not unlike how puppeteers use puppets to store weapons and traps." "Sorry if I'm being insensitive," he said to the two redheads. Rashi merely shrugged. The Toad Sannin's explanation continued, "Of course, since puppets aren't human, there are less constraints when applying seals to them than to a person. That's why Jinchūriki seals like Naruto's or Rashi's are much more complex in design, because humans are going to have to grow and adapt to what's sealed inside them, whereas a puppet is not." Tsunade was nodding along with her teammate's dissertation. "So Suna basically created an autonomous puppet that would release, what, chakra? Constantly? That seems to be the gist, yeah. See, the seal is, loose might be the best way to describe it, but it appears to be intentional. It seems to have been designed to allow constant two-way interaction between the Bijū and the host, which is definitely not what puppeteering seals are intended to do. I can't say what it would be like to constantly struggle against another entity for control, but," he glanced at Gaara, "I'm guessing we're looking at the result." Rashi snorted. "Explains a lot. So again, is he stable?" Tsunade asked. "The Gojyo Fuin is an auto-raid Fuinjutsu, and whatever primary seal they use looks like some version of a Dusuzu Fuin, which is a pretty old-school even-a-raid Fuinjutsu." "Yes or no, Jiraiya," she growled. "So long as the Gojyo Fuin is active, the connection between Gaara and his Bijū is cut off." Mostly. Tsunade was starting to sound like how she had in her office the day before, when Utakata and Rashi had been reluctant to answer her questions. Angry, Gaara thought. Jiraiya scratched the side of his face with a finger. "I can't explain it, but Gaara has been able to use his sand abilities despite the Gojyo Fuin. Little things mostly, so I haven't been all that concerned, but even that shouldn't be possible." Rashi started laughing, and all eyes turned to him. "You're all daft." Tsunade's eyebrow twitched. "Excuse me, sand ain't his Bijū ability." "It's not." The Sannin chorused. Gaara stared at the older redhead, curious what he would say next. So what is it? Jiraiya asked. The Iwa Nin cast a strange look at the younger redhead before telling the taller leaf shinobi, "Don't matter none if he's sealed." Tsunade grunted, arms crossed over her chest. Helpful. So, Jiraiya, what's the next step? The Toad Sannin shrugged. Nothing much I can do. It's not typically a good idea to tamper with an existing seal, especially if you don't know exactly what it is. I kind of understand its base components, but that's not the whole picture, and sealing a Bijū. He sighed. It's not exactly a well-studied field, Heim. I'm good, but even I wouldn't want to fiddle around with it. I don't know of any way to fix a Jinchūriki seal without completely reinventing it. Can you not do that? All eyes turned to Gaara. The redhead stared at them in turn, expression blank. He wondered if they'd forgotten he was in the room, since most of their discussion had seemed to ignore his presence. It was unusual. The citizens of Suna had constantly been wary of him, even when they weren't worth his attention, that he'd always known he was being observed, too dangerous to leave unattended for any stretch of time. But now, to be in a situation where he was the weakest person in the room, so much so that he could go ignored by everyone else, he didn't know the word for what he felt. He'd told Rashi the previous night that he was powerless, and despite the older man's claim to the contrary, it felt truer than ever. Before meeting Naruto, knowing there were people out there stronger than him but whom he couldn't kill would have driven him to madness. Now it just seemed commonplace. Like another grain of sand within his gourd, indistinguishable from all the rest. Jiraiya cleared his throat and answered, "Like I said, I'm not exactly an expert on Jinchūriki seals in particular, so I can't say for sure, but to do so would require extracting the Bijū, holding it in a temporary container, creating a new seal, and then resealing it." "It'll kill ya," Rashi announced bluntly. Gaara blinked at the older redhead. "Ah, so you're telling me I agreed to take in a mentally unstable Jinchūriki with an equally unstable seal that we can't fix," Tsunade summarized. Her fingers were rubbing circles around her temples. "Wonderful. Is it too late to return him to Suna? They will kill me." Again, Gaara found 3 pairs of eyes on him, though this time they seemed less surprised and more questioning. "The Kazekage is only interested in how valuable something is to the village," he explained, voice monotone. "He could not control me, and spent years trying to kill me because he could not use me for his intended purposes. I was more valuable dead, until he sought to use me for the invasion." The Sunanin looked down at his hands. "That was a failure. What value I did have is gone, as is my reason for existing. Now, like this," he flexed one hand experimentally, watching tiny granules of sand swirl around his palm, "he will certainly succeed in killing me." Silence reigned for several moments before Jiraiya offered, "If it's any consolation, your father's dead, so no worries there." Gaara blinked again. Ah. He wondered if he should have felt something at that news, and if so, what? "It matters not. Suna does not tolerate failure. So he stays," Tsunade concluded. Jiraiya nodded. "Seems that way." "Great," she grumbled. "One more thing to add to the watch list. So, you cannot help me." Tsunade arched an eyebrow at the Sand Genin. "What do you mean?" "Naruto, he said that people have helped him, and that those people would help me." "Jiraiya helped Naruto when we were looking for you," he noted, "but he just said he cannot help me." "You do not know how to help me," he addressed Tsunade. Teal eyes flickered to Rashi. "He does not trust me enough to help. If yet fought Ichibi, yet know why." "Look kid," Jiraiya interjected, pausing when the Sunanin turned to level him with an intense stare. The Sannin seemed to reconsider his words, saying instead, "Gaara, it's not that we don't want to help you, but in this case, it just may not be possible. You think Tsunade or I want to have a Jinchūriki with a questionable seal in the village?" The Kazekage did not. The redhead glanced at Tsunade before returning his attention to her teammate. "I imagine the Hokage would not either." "That's right," Jiraiya agreed. "Will you also try to kill me?" "No," the Toad Sannin immediately asserted. "We'll do what we can to keep you on the straight and narrow here, but there are limits to our abilities, to what help we can provide. What you're asking may be stretching what's plausible. Ichen. Gaara, you may not want to hear this, but sometimes the only way to get the help you need is to help yourself," Tsunade said. He blinked at the Hokage. "Help, myself? Your psychological evaluation has a lot of red flags that concern me." Between that and some of the things I've heard from both Jiraiya and Rashi, I think you could benefit from professional help. You're not a shinobi of Konoha, and based on what Jiraiya said, it doesn't seem like you're currently capable of losing control and causing harm to the village, so I'm not going to order you to do anything. My experience has been that forcing a patient to do something makes them more unwilling to receive the treatment they need, so if you really want help, you'll have to make that decision for yourself. She nodded to Jiraiya, throwing a curt bob of her head to Rashi. I'm done here. I trust you can finish up. Yeah, I got it, Haim. Tsunade left at her teammate's reassurance, and when she was gone, Jiraiya told Gaara, you're free to go, too. I've got things to tend to, and I suspect you have things to think about. At the white-haired man's dismissal, the redhead picked up his discarded sash and gourd and left through the same door Tsunade had. He found his way back outside, returning to the courtyard where he'd initially started his morning and finding a measure of solace in the isolation of the wide outdoors. Hey, Gaara! He turned his head to find Naruto walking through the entrance to the compound, a duffel bag thrown over his shoulder. The blonde was waving at him with unbridled enthusiasm, and Gaara exhaled loudly through his nose in a rare expression of irritation. Handling Naruto while sealed and forced to suffer the Leaf Shinobi's optimistic babbling had already been a test of his willpower. Having to do it after he'd been told by the people the blonde had said would help him that they couldn't help him was just, again, he couldn't put a word to the feeling. That was also becoming annoying. Ever since Yashimaru had died, Gaara hadn't known an emotion stronger than the desire to kill those meant to prove his existence. Now, in the span of a month, he'd experienced too many instances of pain, loneliness, frustration, sadness, and once, for a brief moment, a vague recollection from his childhood that felt unfamiliarly like hope. It was too difficult to follow each emotion evoked from being around Naruto, not to mention trying to figure out what those around the blonde, Jiraiya, Tsunade, Rashi, Utakata, felt. This place is awesome. It's way bigger than my apartment and, hey, are you okay? A hand landed on his shoulder, and Gaara twitched at the contact. He turned to face Naruto, who recoiled slightly at the quickness of the movement. The blonde took a step backwards, remembering his fellow Jinchūriki's preference for space. I do not know how to feel. How to feel? You mean about being here? Did Tsunade and Jiraiya-sensei say something after I got kicked out yesterday? That sucked, by the way, they. The redhead shook his head, closing his eyes against the onslaught of questions. Even without mother shrieking inside his skull, he could feel the familiar beginnings of a headache. Shut up, he growled. Naruto immediately obeyed the directive, and when Gaara felt he could open his eyes again, he found the same concern Yashimaru had once shown him shimmering in azure blue irises. You said people would help me, but there is nothing anyone can do for me. What do you mean? I am broken. My purpose was taken from me, and no one is able to fix me. What? That's crap. Now Naruto looked mad. He'd seen that expression on some of the stronger shinobi in the hidden sand, those who had wanted to kill him but couldn't. You're not broken, and you don't need to be fixed. Did Jiraiya-sensei tell you that? He started marching towards the building's entrance. I'm gonna beat the crap out of him. Yeah, ain't gonna get anything from him. Rashiaji, your friend's dealin' with something he's never thought before, Rashi said, ambling out of the same entrance Naruto had just been heading for, and it ain't Jiraiya's fault. Yeah, gotta let him work it out. But, the blonde looked back at Gaara, it's not right. I promised Gaara that we would help him, and now you're saying there's nothing we can do. Rashi shrugged. Not way he wants. Can't you train him, like you trained me? The Iwanin barked a laugh before turning and walking back into their new abode. Naruto frowned as he departed, unable to interpret the older Jinchūriki's non-response. He turned back to face Gaara, stalking towards the Sunanin and reaching out to grab his arm. Gaara flinched away from the blonde's touch, and for a moment, another emotion he couldn't identify, sadness maybe, but different, flickered across Naruto's features. It disappeared from view when Naruto began to stalk around the courtyard, urging, come on. The redhead followed at a sedate pace. Where are we going? We're gonna find someone who can help, Naruto asserted. There's gotta be someone. Rashiaji's not really great at the, people thing. Gaara stared at the back of the other boy's head. People thing? He's kinda mean, the blonde elaborated, but he's not so bad when you get used to him. What we need is, hey, Utakata and I. The brunette who had approached him earlier that morning was sitting in front of a small koi pond. Gaara could make out a small, intricate design of 3 overlapping spheres of different sizes at the nape of the teenager's blue kimono. At the sound of his name, Utakata turned to look at them. "Oh, Naruto. And Gaara. I guess your exams went well." "No. No?" The brunette echoed. "Utakata and everyone's saying they can't help Gaara, but I promised him that we could," Naruto answered in the redhead's place. His voice was a little high-pitched, almost desperate, as he spoke to the older Jinchūriki. "You helped me, can you help him, too?" Utakata smiled. "I'm more than happy to help out, Naruto, you know that." He turned to the Sunanin. "What kind of help are you looking for?" "Jiraiya says my seal is stable-ish," Gaara intoned, "and Rashi will not train me to become strong." The Kirinin blinked at him. "Oh. Well, I understand why you came to me, but I'm not sure there's anything I can do about those things. I'm not skilled in Fuinjutsu, and I don't think I can really train you either. I use Suiton, I assume you're versed in Futon. Sand. Definitely not something I know how to train." Another expression that looked like sadness, yet different from how Naruto had looked. "I'm really sorry, you know I'd help if I could." Gaara turned to face Naruto. "As I said, no one can help me." He turned and walked away even as Naruto protested to Utakata and the pair engaged in a fierce debate. The redhead returned to where his morning had started, taking a seat on the roof of the compound and staring out across Konoha with eyes that saw nothing. As he told Rashi the night before, there was a part of him that wanted to believe the things Naruto said. He'd spent almost a month watching the blonde work unyieldingly on whatever task Jiraiya had given him despite every setback, and that gave credence to the strength the redhead sought. In that way, Naruto was someone he wished to emulate, and the Leaf native had promised him that the people he'd learned from would help him. Now that they tried and failed to get him that same aid, it felt like the blonde had lied to him. And that made him. He frowned, unable to process the emotion. It was like being annoyed, a feeling he was becoming all too familiar with, between his brother's antics in the Chunin exams and how Naruto hovered over him, but much stronger. "Gaara!" Teal eyes turned to find Naruto leaping to the roof. The blonde paused in his approach. "Hey, don't be mad." Mad? He'd never had a reason to be mad before. "Is this anger?" Naruto continued talking. "It doesn't matter that Rashiaji and Utakata and I don't know what to do. Or anyone else. I'll help you, no matter what. That's a promise, believe it." "Why? Why?" The blonde repeated. "Because we're friends, and that's what friends do." He scratched the side of his head with a finger. "I think, anyway, haven't really had many friends." Gaara grunted, empathizing with the sentiment but unable to truly vocalize it. "Why should I believe you?" You keep saying that people will help, or that you will help, but nothing supports your claims. You wish to be friends, but do not know what that means. You have said nothing true." He turned away from Naruto. "Following you was supposed to make me strong, but that does not seem possible." "Why not?" Gaara returned his gaze to the blonde, staring at him with an unyielding intensity that questioned if the other boy had even heard what he'd said. "It took me a while to get strong, but I did it, and I'll keep getting stronger to protect everyone. Rashiaji and Utakata and I always tell me that things take time." His brow furrowed. "It sucks, but that's just the way it is sometimes. You just gotta be patient." "To what end?" "To get better." The blonde hedged. "I don't understand." "Get better." Gaara repeated, tasting the words. It wasn't the first time someone had mentioned that to him. Rashi had suggested something similar the other night, and Tsunade had said the same this morning, but coming from Naruto, the one person he wanted to believe in, the idea gave him pause. For so long, he'd been listening to the blonde say that he would be able to help and that things would be okay going forward, and in a way, the redhead had made decisions because he'd been relying upon those assertions. "Hey, Gaara," Naruto began, drawing the redhead's attention back to him, "everything will be okay, okay? You can believe in me. I know it might seem hard now, but it's nothing compared to what we've gone through so far, right?" He'd started walking towards the Ichibi Jinchūriki and was now within the Sand Shinobi's personal space, closer than anyone else dared to get. With deliberate slowness, he reached out a hand and placed it on Gaara's shoulder. "Don't give up, okay? Things you'll for sure get better, believe it." Gaara shifted his gaze to stare at the tan hand resting on his shoulder. Naruto's desire to be close was starting to become familiar, and though he couldn't say he liked it, it didn't bother him as much as he thought it would. It had been a long time since anyone had wanted to be close to him, and without the urge to kill people echoing incessantly in his head, he could remember a time before he'd lived only for himself, when Yashimaru would get close and he didn't mind the nearness. He didn't have a verbal response to the blonde's optimism. Instead, his head bobbed once, slowly, in brief acknowledgement of what Naruto had said, though he still wasn't sure he fully believed the other boy. Naruto smiled at him, and Gaara again felt the strange urge to believe the blonde despite all his misgivings. "I've gotta go. Utakata and I said he wants to pick up our training. You gonna be okay here?" The redhead blinked, expression implacable, which the other boy took as affirmation. "Alright, I'm gonna head out then. Let me know if you need something, okay? Anything. I'll be there, I swear it." Gaara nodded again, and with one last backwards glance, the blonde left. Teal Eyes watched him go, waiting until he was out of sight before he resumed his vacant stare, this time at the entrance of the Senju complex. His conversations over the course of the day replayed in his mind as the sun traversed the sky. He wasn't used to talking with people, or having people focused on him, or, really any of what had taken place over the last several weeks, all of which had given him much to think about, more than he'd ever needed to devote time to in years past, and that confused him. Worst of all, he didn't know where to go from here, and that was annoying. So he sat and waited, looking at nothing and waiting for something to make sense. By the time the sun was low on the horizon, he had no more answers than he had when Naruto had left him. Movement caught his attention, the first he'd seen in hours, and Teal Eyes flickered over to where a figure with blonde hair was striding through the entranceway. His body moved of its own accord, jumping down to intersect Tsunade's path into the house. She assumed a defensive position automatically at his presence. "Gaara," she acknowledged, honey eyes narrowed and muscles tense, "I don't recommend doing that again. Some might consider it hostile." "Ah." Tsunade noticed his lack of aggressive intent and relaxed her posture. "Can I help you with something?" "Yes." He didn't know how, but that seemed to be the right answer. Tsunade arched an eyebrow at him when he didn't elaborate. "Okay, and how can I help you?" "Hello Gaara. I don't know if you remember me." "I do." Green eyes blinked at him. "Okay." The man watching at him had sandy blonde hair styled similarly to Gaara's own short spikes in front, and a long ponytail held in place by a topknot in back. His hands were laced together in his lap, a sleeveless, auburn-colored vest held closed over Konoha's regulation green flak jacket. "Given the different circumstances we're under, I think it best to start over. I'm Yamanaka Inoichi. Tsunade-sama informed me that you'd like therapy." "I need help," Gaara intoned. Inoichi nodded. "It's a good sign if you can recognize that. This may sound indelicate, but when I first did your psychological evaluation, you didn't seem like the type of person who would accept help. There are no other options available to me." "That's unfortunate," Inoichi allowed. "Why do you feel that way?" Gaara blinked. "Why?" Inoichi leaned forward in his chair, one of two that had been placed across from each other in the same room Gaara's seal had been evaluated in. The redhead remained standing despite the other man's offer to take a seat at the beginning of their meeting. "I can offer you advice and guidance, but our sessions will require you to be honest with how you feel, and more importantly, why you feel that way. While I can guide you down the path to get to the root of your problems, you'll have to take the lead." He returned to a more lax position. "So, why don't you tell me why you feel like you have no other options?" Teal stared at Green for a long time, during which the Yamanaka's gaze remained steadfast. It was strange that he didn't look away. Gaara was used to others being unable to deal with the intensity of his gaze. He blinked first, breaking their standoff, a feeling of defeat washing over him. "Naruto said he would help me, but he cannot. He said that others would help me, but they cannot. My seal is faulty. My strength is diminished. I have no purpose." He'd lost track of how many times he'd heard or admitted those words throughout the day, and it seemed like the words got more definitive each time. "No value. Well, I can understand why you seem to feel like you need help," Inoichi noted. "That's quite a list. Let's take it one at a time then. Why do you think your seal is faulty?" "Jiraiya said so." "That does seem fairly definitive, unfortunately. I can't say I understanding much about Fuinjutsu, but Jiraiya-sama's reputation precedes him. There's no way to fix it, none that he knows." Inoichi's head bobbed up and down. "Do you want it fixed?" Gaara stared at the older man. No one had asked him what he wanted before. I would, he replied slowly. He'd admitted as much during the evaluation. It would help fix me. Gaara, if you think of yourself as broken, the only one you hurt is yourself. Everyone needs help sometimes. Do you? Inoichi let out a short laugh, so different from how Rashi sounded. For a brief moment, Gaara wished he knew why they were so dissimilar. I'm guessing you don't know much about Konoha's clans. I don't mean to brag, but my teammates and I are kind of famous. My abilities are much more effective when used in conjunction with theirs. So yes, I need help as well. He cupped his chin with one hand. Do you consider it a weakness to need help? You were a participant in the recent Chunin exams, so you must have had teammates of your own. Teammates? Gaara repeated. Yes. They were my siblings. It must have been interesting to work with your siblings. I'm an only child, but having grown up with Shikaku and Choza, I feel like I kind of know what it's like to have brothers. They were present. Inoichi nodded once but didn't say anything. It felt like he wanted the redhead to speak without prompting, so Gaara continued, I did not need their help. They were a means to an end. They had no value but to get me into your village. That's a very utilitarian way of looking at things. Why do you say that? That is how the Kazekage viewed his shinobi. The Kazekage is your father, Inoichi noted. And you just spoke of him in the past tense, so I have to assume you know he's dead, but the way you talk about your family makes it seem like you don't care about them. They did not care about me, so why should I care about them, the redhead intoned, and even though it should have been a question, it was stated as a fact. Reciprocity is a fair way of looking at the world, the leaf shinobi acknowledged, but as a father myself, I have to say that your situation makes me a little sad. Sad? My daughter's your age, you may have seen her in the Chunin exams, and to think of her living a life where she sees her teammates as mission assets only, or me as a sort of authority figure incapable of love. Love? Gaara interrupted. The word triggered something in him, and Inoichi's face seemed to morph into Yashimaru's in his mind's eye, their similar hair color helping his uncle's image superimpose itself on the therapist's. He closed his eyes and shook his head several times in an effort to rid himself of the image, his breathing becoming hitched. Gaara, are you okay? What's wrong? I do not, love, he rasped. He continued shaking his head, falling into the chair that had been set out for him. It hurts. Gaara, I need you to listen to me. Listen to my voice. His tone was calm and steady, soothing despite its deeper timbre. Keep your eyes closed and breathe in. Deeply. Now breathe out. Good. Keep doing that, and then when you're ready, open your eyes. Take your time, there's no rush. Following the Yamanaka's guidance, the redhead's breathing slowly evened out. When he eventually reopened his eyes, Inoichi's concerned visage greeted him. You helped me. The sandy blonde nodded. It's what I do. Is that the first time you've experienced an anxiety attack? Gaara shook his head. I'll be honest, it would be a huge breakthrough if you're willing to talk about what triggers the attacks, but given how fresh this one was, I would understand if you don't want to. My uncle, Gaara replied slowly. He was different. Like Naruto. You're referring to Uzumaki Naruto? At the redhead's nod, Inoichi probed, I'm not familiar with Naruto on a personal level, so how do you mean different? I do not know how to describe it. They care. Inoichi let out a low hum. I think I understand. Based on how you've talked about your family, I'm going to guess that something happened with your uncle. Gaara nodded. Something traumatic? Another nod. Can you be more specific? The Sunanin stared blankly ahead, and after several seconds of unresponsiveness, Inoichi gave his own nod. That's okay, you may not be ready to talk about it. The older man leaned forward in his chair and continued in an even voice, Gaara, if you're really interested in getting help, I'm invested in helping you. And we'll move at your pace, no matter how long it takes. Truthfully, your progress since I performed your first evaluation is beyond what I would have expected given your pathologies. I think that, in order to keep moving forward, we should set small goals for you to achieve at the end of each session. Does that sound like something you're willing to work at? The response came to his lips unthinkingly, pulled by the lure of help he'd so desperately been denied in recent days. Yes. Inoichi smiled at him. That's good. My wife and daughter are waiting for me, so I'm going to have to leave shortly, but why don't we set a goal for next week? Is there something in particular you'd like to focus on? His first instinct was to say no, because he didn't fully understand what Inoichi was asking of him even though he'd agreed to it, but something familiar about what the leaf shinobi was asking gave him pause. Slowly, as if was remembering the words as he spoke them, Gaara said, Rashi told me to find something to center myself. Something to center yourself, Inoichi repeated. Like a hobby? At Gaara's nod, he probed, okay, well, is there something you like to do? Killing. How about something less destructive and more relaxing? Inoichi suggested. What do you do when you have free time? Nothing. Inoichi quirked an eyebrow. Nothing? I find that hard to believe. It's not an easy thing to remain completely unengaged for hours on end. I watch the moon. Inoichi rose from the chair and approached the bookshelves, running a finger along the spines of the tomes. After several minutes of reviewing the books, he let out an ah of success, pulling a text from its place and walking back over to Gaara. He offered it to the redhead, who slowly reached out his own hand to receive it. When you next have free time, take a look at this. It's from the Shodai's time, so it might be a little outdated, but you might find it interesting. Gaara adjusted the book so that the cover was readable. The night sky, he read. It's about astronomy, the Yamanaka said. If you're going to watch the moon, you may as well learn about it, right? There's a lot you can learn if you take the time. Time! That was something Gaara had in spades. Thank you. Inoichi nodded. One last thing before I leave. Everyone has value, including you, otherwise we as people wouldn't have purpose. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, even yourself. He opened the door with a parting, I'll be by next week. Oh, Jiraiya-sama, good evening. Evening, Inoichi. Gaara looked on to find the white-haired Sannin leaning against the door frame, leveling the redhead with an even gaze. So kid, how'd it go? The Sunanin mulled over his conversation with Inoichi. It felt so different when compared to Rashi's cynicism, Tsunade's frustration, Jiraiya's helplessness, or Naruto's anger, like the sandy blonde wanted to help him and actually could. Actually had. It was. Good, that's good. He gestured with his head towards the book in Gaara's hands. What's that you got there? The redhead held it up so Jiraiya could read the title for himself. One white eyebrow arched in surprise. Didn't take you to be much of an astronomer. Or, a reader, to be honest. I am not. He turned the book over in his hands so the title was once more facing him. Inoichi believes it will interest me. It's not a bad thing to have a hobby. He said that as well. Inoichi's a smart guy, Jiraiya said. You're in good hands with him. He also said you have a reputation in Konoha. The Sannin smirked at him. Ho ho, well, the great toad sage does have a way with the ladies. Gaara's eyebrows furrowed. For Fuinjutsu, Jiraiya seemed to sober up at the interjection. Ah. Well, yes, that's also true, but like I said earlier, my expertise only goes so far. I'm sorry that I can't help you. Will you train me? The older man's eyes widened at the request. Sorry. Even Gaara seemed surprised that he'd voiced the question, a brief silence settling between them as he processed what he'd said. I need help, he admitted slowly, working through his own thought process, but I do not possess the necessary skills. Naruto said Rashi and Utakata would help me, but they cannot. You cannot fix me, but you have knowledge I do not. I need that knowledge to help myself. You want to learn Fuinjutsu in order to fix your own seal? Do I have that right? In time. Can't say I saw this coming. Jiraiya fixed him with a gimlet eye, silently scrutinizing him for several moments. Alright, kid, you seem pretty determined, and I'm kind of impressed by your dedication here. You keep working with Inoichi and don't cause any trouble, and I'll teach you what I know about Fuinjutsu. Gaara blinked. You will. You're a friend of Naruto, Jiraiya offered by way of explanation, and it seems like you're genuinely trying to be better. If you need my help to facilitate that, who am I to deny you? I'd rather see you trained right than left to fend for yourself. I suspect that's part of how you got to be the way you are. He made for the door, not yet willing to talk about his past with the older man, and stepped through it as Jiraiya moved aside for him. The Sannin's dark eyes stayed on his back as he ventured down the hallway and outside, finding the cool embrace of night waiting for him. One jump later found him back on the roof, where the moon shone down on him with white serenity. As the events of the past couple days spun in his head, it felt a little like things had come full circle, especially since he was back where he'd started, except, now the circle was larger. His requests for help, to fix himself, to become strong in the same way Naruto had, to reclaim his purpose, were no longer completely unheeded. He was worth something, and it felt strange. But good. So he opened the night sky to the first page and began reading. Chapter 12, The Irakama's Freedom. He woke with a gasp that he immediately stifled, unwilling to draw the attention caused from making too much noise. His right hand slid beneath the torn rag that had once been a shirt, the gesture completely automatic. Ba dump, ba dump. A far-off explosion briefly interrupted the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, but the sound wasn't anything too unusual in the bowels of the prison, and he released a quiet sigh as his internal cadence resumed, relief flooding his body. Still alive. One could never be too sure after visiting, whoever it was. He didn't know the man's name, not that knowing would help him. His nose twitched, something in the stale air causing him to sneeze. In the dim light filtering in from the lamplit hallway, he could see particles of dust raining from the ceiling. He stared upwards mutely, a hand to his brow to protect his eyes from the particulates. Then the world exploded, earth and debris collapsing around him and forcing him to scramble for safety in a corner of his cell. The yells and screams of his fellow prisoners echoed around him as everything they knew fell to pieces amidst the rumbling of their cages. Seconds, minutes, hours later, he didn't know, time didn't seem to pass in a determinable fashion in captivity, everything stopped, and he opened light brown eyes to find harsh sunlight beaming upon him, bathing him in a golden aura. A hole had opened in the back wall of his cell, above his head and out of reach, but a mound of broken rubble and hard earth led up to it, practically inviting him to escape. To freedom. He clambered over the debris and emerged in a barren wasteland, nothing but rock, dirt, and sun as far as the eye could see. Compared to a veritable eternity in captivity, it was paradise. He took one step forward, then another, and began the long trek to an unknown location. Anywhere was better than where he'd come from. He didn't know the time, but he could tell it was earlier than he was used to. Han stared at the ceiling from the two small futon in his chosen room, trying to combat the irritation that seemed a permanent fixture of his thoughts by focusing on the improved circumstances of his situation. It was better in Konoha, but that was like saying being adopted by the Tsuchikage had been an improvement over his previous life. It was technically true, but not a great metric of how good his life was. Just because he wasn't being watched by Inoki's henchmen didn't mean he didn't feel the eyes of the leaf on him whenever he left his room. Tsunade, Jiraiya, the cat-masked Anbu, even Rashi's dark stare and gruff voice felt like scrutiny, despite knowing the redhead was no ally of Konoha's. He'd learned in the academy that evolution was a slow process, and while advancing from where he'd started to where he was now had gone faster, it still felt like he wasn't moving forward nearly as fast as he wanted. Every new stage of life just seemed like a slightly larger prison, and he was tired of being a captive. Scowl hidden by his armor, Han leveraged himself into a standing position and stalked to the door, wrenching it open and finding an empty hallway before him. The chinking of his armor as he walked disturbed the silence of the surrounding darkness. He moved towards the atrium, where the pre-dawn light served as a guide to freedom. "Ah, Han, right?" He turned at the voice, finding Tsunade stepping out from the area where the kitchen and dining room were located. She carried a saucer and teacup with one hand, bringing the cup to her mouth with the other and taking a long, slow sip. Han glowered, though she appeared unfazed by his sour expression, continuing to drink leisurely from her cup. It was impossible to tell if the blonde's lack of reaction was because his face was mostly concealed or if she was just that composed. "Humph. I'll take that as a yes," Tsunade said. "You're up early." He didn't want to reply, but the retort slipped past his lips before he could stop himself. "The same could be said of you. The duties of the Hokage, unfortunately." "And Shizun wants me to drink less sake," she muttered petulantly, raising the saucer and cup in a gesture of acknowledgement, "so here I am." "And you?" This time he managed to hold his tongue. Despite her pleasant facade, he reminded himself that Tsunade wasn't any different than Inoki, a village leader leveraging everything to benefit her people. And herself. The Hokage nodded, and the Iwanin felt that there was understanding in the gesture despite having no idea where that understanding came from. "That's fine. Given Iwa and Konoha's history, an open dialogue takes time. Being on speaking terms with Rashi isn't something I can say I ever would have expected." "You say that like that's a good thing." Tsunade smirked, then hid the gesture with another sip of tea. Han scowled again, feeling like he'd fallen into a trap. Diplomacy is an important hallmark of a good leader. My grandfather, the Shodai, was renowned for being open to unusual alliances, and my sensei, the Sandame, was much the same. I would be a poor Hokage to not follow the examples they've set. The annoyance in his scowl switched from himself to the Sannin. It wasn't her fault that Inoki was a shitty leader who only cared about the strength of his village rather than creating allies, even when those allies were other rock shinobi, but it left a sour taste in his mouth regardless. Tsunade gestured with her head towards one of the doors on the opposite side of the atrium. Why don't we continue this elsewhere? I'm not going to strike a deal with you just because we're sharing a hallway, Han growled. I'd be shocked if you did, the blonde admitted calmly, sipping again from her teacup. I'm not inviting you in to interrogate you. You don't have to talk at all if you don't want to. But my conditions to stay here included a full physical exam. And if I refuse? Tsunade's honey eyes closed with her smile, and though the expression appeared pleasant, her body emanated no warmth. I'll throw you out myself. I'd like to see you try. I assure you you wouldn't. Han let out a snort of genuine amusement, tickled by the idea of a woman 2 heads shorter and 2 decades older trying to bodily remove him from the premises. Tsunade remained unaffected by his reaction, and the Iwa got the distinct impression that she wasn't intimidated. Then again, he supposed, Inoki was only a fraction of his height, and that Tsuchikage carried great power in his diminutive stature. After several seconds of silence, he grunted. Fine. An excellent decision. She gestured to the door. After you. The steam user stalked through the entryway the Sannin had indicated and was greeted by rows of bookshelves. They surrounded a wooden table set in the center of the room, and 2 chairs facing each other were placed off to the side. You can sit on the table, Tsunade directed, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing around them. Sorry for the poor accommodations, we're not used to people of your size. You're going to have to remove your armor. No. I wasn't asking. It stays on, Han rebutted, and his deep voice held a hint of a threat. You'll either take it off willingly, or I'll peel it off you piece by piece, Tsunade said, tone unyielding, his own threat reverberating in her timbre back at him. Damn woman, Han growled, frustration in every word, you're as stubborn as the Tsuchikage. Tsunade barked a laugh. Comes with the job. I think I'll take that as a compliment. The Iwa stood up, reaching up and doffing the red kasa covering his head to reveal 4 stubby protrusions angling backwards out of his skull. He avoided eye contact with the blonde, shoving down the decades-old embarrassment that reared its head, and set the hat gingerly on the table before taking off his black gloves. I wouldn't. The dark obi that held his gray gi closed was untied, it and the cloth itself joining the growing pile of accessories. There was a moment of hesitation before he unclasped the bronze ring circling his neck, and with a couple of extra movements, the armor encasing his upper body came loose and fell off. Tsunade pursed her lips together until they barely appeared to be 2 separate features. I see. Old scars were spread liberally over the Iwa's muscled body, off-white blemishes against pale skin. More noticeable were the stark white bands of skin around the giant's wrists. Tsunade had seen similar marks during the wars, and was confident that, if the armor covering Han's legs were off, there would be a matching pair in the vicinity of the Jinchūriki's ankles. The methodology for keeping prisoners was a fairly universal constant across the elemental nations. She cleared her throat, the scars didn't bother her as much as the implications of what he'd been through. That's sufficient. If you wouldn't mind taking a seat. Han heeded the request silently, and Tsunade moved close enough so she could run hands shrouded in green chakra over his form. He watched her work with hard, pupil-less brown eyes, as naked as he'd ever been in front of someone, and yet, aside from the initial reaction, Tsunade made the experience seem normal. For once, he felt appreciative of the professionalism displayed by a figure of authority. She remained unperturbed as the scan progressed, hands moving from chest to right shoulder. Honey eyes narrowed, and she stepped around the table so she could see his back. Nico! She barked, and the cat-masked Anbu appeared at her side in an instant, head bowed and fist to the floor in a gesture of fealty. Get Jiraiya here, now. The operative didn't even respond, instead disappearing as quickly as he'd come. Han remained silent as she continued to stare at his back, waiting for the Leaf Shinobi's eventual questions. But none came, and she eventually moved back around to his front, holding her elbow with one hand and her chin with the other. She remained like that, contemplative, he thought, until a male voice groaned, Hey, Haim, it's a little early for this. I'm not really at my best right now. I don't particularly care, Jiraiya, Tsunade retorted, arms crossed over her chest. Look at his shoulder. Jiraiya, rubbing sleep from his eyes and grumbling incomprehensibly, walked over to the seated Jinchūriki and peered at his shoulder. He immediately jerked to attention, all traces of lackadaisy disappearing. What the hell? He murmured. The Sannin continued to mutter under his breath as he scrutinized the giant's back, presumably performing his own evaluation. It's definitely one of his, he announced at last. Damn it, Tsunade cursed. One of whose? Han interjected. You know what that is. You don't. There is no purpose in seeking information. It's a Jinchūriki's job to serve its village, Han spat. That's what Inoki would say whenever I asked. Rashi's never said anything. Rashi is a self-serving asshole subservient to the whims of his father to get what he wants, snarled the Iwa. But if he's to be believed, he knows nothing. Since you apparently do know something, perhaps you'd be willing to enlighten me. The request might have sounded polite if it wasn't tinged by the Steam user's bitterness. The seal on your shoulder was created by our former teammate Orochimaru, Jiraiya offered, coming around to stand beside his teammate. One of many, unfortunately. This one looks older, maybe one of his original designs. I'll give props to Iwa, though, they've got a hell of a sealing team. I can't detect any sort of active influence from the seal. There's only a couple of people in Konoha who could manage the same. Could be that the seal is just faulty, Tsunade suggested, especially if you think it's one of his earlier attempts. Always a possibility, Jiraiya agreed. What do you know about Orochimaru? Han asked. More than can be distilled into a 5-minute conversation, the white-haired man said, adding dryly, not that anyone should want to talk about him. Han's fist punched the table upon which he sat. I don't care if it takes me a lifetime, if that bastard is the reason I'm like this, I'll do whatever it takes to kill him. The Sannin exchanged a glance. Orochimaru deserves a lot of heat, but he's never been particularly interested in Jinchūriki, Jiraiya said cautiously. I'm not sure I understand. No one understands. The Iwa roared. Do you think anyone can empathize with a child raised in a prison cell, who finally achieved freedom only to have it stolen by a power-hungry ruler who found it convenient to seal a demon into him? He took a deep breath, placing a hand over his heart as his broad chest swelled with the motion, then released it, knowing that the pair of leaf shinobi before him were not the source of his ire, they were, apparently, his best chance of revenge. In a voice tight with controlled rage, he ground out, everything that's happened to me has been a result of whoever gave me that seal. If that's Orochimaru, then he's a dead man. Easier said than done, Jiraiya said. If you had any idea of how long I've been tracking him. I don't care, Han interrupted fiercely. I have spent my life trying to learn about my past and how I got here, and until now I've gotten nowhere. To finally have an answer, he breathed deep again, and the air seemed a hair more refreshing than when he'd woken up that morning. You don't know what it feels like. Everyone has their own catharsis, Tsunade noted, but Orochimaru. I have no authority over your decisions, but I would consider it a personal failure to not warn you that you've picked a difficult target. And that's putting it mildly. Although you'd be doing Konoha a great service by eliminating him, if your ego can stomach that. Han released a dark, humorless laugh. You think I care about Iwa's quibbles with your village? Both Sannin arched a single eyebrow. Most Iwa do, Tsunade replied. And if I was a true Iwa, I might have the stubborn pride to refuse your aid out of sheer spite for our history, the giant acknowledged. But I have waited for too long with no recompense for my service, and here you are with the answers I've sought. I have no compunctions with betraying Iwa if I can have my vengeance. You sure were a funny hideate for not being a true Iwa, Jiraiya observed with false cheer. Han scoffed. What other options are available to a Jinchūriki? He scrutinized the pair of Sannin with narrowed brown eyes, and in a deep, even voice said, the deal Rashi made with you, I can't say I care about his machinations, but if you're willing to share your knowledge on Orochimaru, I will provide you with whatever information you want. The enemy of my enemy. Tsunade muttered, one hand cupping her chin in thought. Jiraiya peered curiously at her. What are you thinking, Haim? Orochimaru has been a problem in Konoha's side for a long time, she mused. That he was allowed to attack Konoha and kill Sensei was a dangerous misstep on our part. Well, if someone hadn't poisoned me, maybe we could have finally taken care of him once and for all. If I focus my efforts on him. Jiraiya, You've spent the better part of who knows how many years one step behind him every step of the way, the blonde retorted, and what do you have to show for it? Besides, you have other priorities. Akatsuki's out there planning something, and a group of S-class nuke is a bigger threat than the one you have a personal vendetta with. She returned her gaze to the Gobi Jinchūriki. I accept your terms. And while this may be insensitive, I'd like to know, in as much detail as possible, what Orochimaru did to you. Your guess is probably better than mine, considering your knowledge of him, Han groused. It's not like they were dictating notes to me. And Inoki didn't care enough to dig deeper. All that was important was to keep me loyal. He scoffed. Look at where that got him. So you remember nothing. I assumed the prison I was kept in was in the land of Earth, he offered gruffly, otherwise how would IWA have found me? But no, nothing concrete. It's been over 20 years, I don't remember much from before I was turned into a Jinchūriki. Tsunade shrugged. Well, it was worth a shot. Jiraiya, are you done here? Yeah, he checks out. He's got the same seal as Rashi, and it's in good shape. Guess Inoki's big on, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but hey, it works in this case. Wait. Han's brow was furrowed, brown eyes darting speculatively between the pair of Sannin. That's it? You don't have any other questions? No interest in Iwa's forces, or security, or anything. Tsunade arched her own eyebrow in response. Why would I? We're not at war, and I have no intention of starting one. If it's Iwa's intent to start something, then we'd have something to talk about. She paused, as if to give the giant time to confirm whether the hidden rock was planning an assault. He shook his head no, otherwise, I have bigger priorities than learning how another village runs its shinobi. Maybe in the future we'll have something to discuss, but for now, you're free to go. Don't cause trouble. Jiraiya can tell you anything you want to know about Orochimaru. Given his obsession, I'm sure he'll be a better resource than me. Her walk out of the room was interrupted by the IWA Nin's call. I realize I have no standing to ask this of you, he began, but I'd prefer if Rashi didn't know about this. Any of it. Doctor-patient confidentiality, Tsunade replied without turning around, and then continued her exit. Han grabbed his armor and began to put it back on, finding a shred of comfort returning with the concealment of his scars and the gobi's horns. So, what can you tell me about Orochimaru? When Han stepped out into the courtyard, he was greeted by the crisp autumn air and early morning sunlight. He breathed deeply, feeling his chest expand with the motion, and took a moment to enjoy the Land of Fire's idyllic atmosphere. The land of Earth was so dusty and desolate, devoid of the bright reds and auburns that decorated the nearby trees, that it felt like being given new life in a beautiful land. Like dying and ascending to a better place. He smirked to himself, the expression once more hidden by his armor. In a way, he could understand how Rashi had gotten absorbed in the Hidden Leaf's agenda, or the younger Jinchūriki's, the one in blue. The Land of Fire was, softer, perhaps, than the Hidden Rock, more inviting. IWA was all hard edges, rigorous demands and no leniency, except, apparently, when it came to Rashi, and he'd been raised knowing that there was little purpose in defying the Tsuchikage. But the Hokage was clearly different. Understanding in a way that the old Tsuchikage had never been and would never be, while still retaining her authority. Han couldn't say he knew much about the blonde Sannin, but she carried her power like a cloak, and didn't seem to need to resort to the same tactics Inoki did to wield it effectively. He found that difference refreshing. There was no love lost between the villages hidden in leaf and rock. He'd lost track of the number of Konohanin he'd killed during the Third Shinobi World War, and that she was willing to overlook their history for the greater good was simultaneously conciliatory and cutthroat. And now, armed with the identity of the person who had set his entire life veering off whatever course it should have been on, the burden he'd been carrying for over 2 decades, the one that was weightier than his armor, felt just a little lighter. There was a long road ahead still. Jiraiya had cautioned as much during their discussion, but having an answer to even that most basic question after years of stonewalling and dismissals was like finding an oasis in the desert. Ugh, come on Utakata and I, this is so boring. Can't we do something more fun? Han looked over at the voice, finding the short blonde child Rashi had kicked out of the Hokage's office sitting on the ground beside the blue-clad brunette. Sorry, Naruto, but I think this is the best way to continue your Suiton training. He could hear the blonde let out a grumble and see him fidget restlessly, trying to settle himself in a more comfortable position. What are you doing? He asked, his deep voice cutting through the still morning air. Both boys turned to look at him. Meditation, replied the blue-clad one, Utakata, he presumed. Why? Naruto can access the abilities of the other Jinchūriki, Utakata explained. Mine is Shibandama, which works through Suiton. This is the best training method for it. That's the stupidest thing I've heard since Rashi convinced me to come to this place. Utakata frowned. I'm sorry you feel that way, but this is how we've trained up to this point. The elements are easier to learn while in certain emotional states. And you think teaching Zen is how to best learn Suiton? Water is calm and tranquil. If you dam it up. Han snarled. Keep it contained, don't disturb it. Why was everyone's solution to a problem imprisonment? What about tsunamis? Floods? Tides, whirlpools? Water is not just a stationary force that sits around waiting for something to occur. Those are events caused by external forces. Utakata protested. They're not implicit to the nature of water itself, and training someone to do something against their nature is idiotic. You, boy, he pointed to the blonde, whose blue eyes were flickering between the two older shinobi, if you really want to learn something, fight me. I'm sorry, what? The blonde pumped his fist into the air and hopped to his feet. Yeah, alright. Naruto, wait. Shinobi who wait don't live long, Han interjected, speeding forward and slamming a palm into the blonde's sternum. The force of the blow sent Naruto soaring across the koi pond he and Utakata had been seated before. He hit the ground and tumbled for a dozen feet before finding his footing and popping upright. Utakata had already jumped to his feet and leapt away at the first sign of movement. He let out a curse, his hands forming signs. What is it with you Iwanin? Suiton, a hand on his shoulder drew his attention away from completing his ninjutsu, his head swiveling to meet dark eyes. Rashi? Let them be. Are you insane? Ya want Han to get used to this, This way. Trust me. Utakata turned away from the older Iwanin when he heard Naruto's call. The blonde was waving at him. Don't worry, Utakata and I got this. He ran across the koi pond at Han, a straight charge, and when the giant swung at him, he slid under the attack, popping up behind the armored shinobi and throwing a punch at the man's kidney. Han bent his knee backwards, the heel of his armored foot digging into the blonde's stomach before his fist could even connect. Naruto wheezed, his lungs empty of air, and the Iwanin turned slowly to find the boy bent over, clutching his belly. Is that all? I would have expected more from someone trained by Rashi. I'm not done, Naruto gasped. Off to the side, Han heard Rashi let out a snort. He almost sounded amused, if he thought the redhead capable of such feeling. It seems you are. No way. He snapped, voice stronger. His hands came together, index and middle fingers straight up, ring fingers and pinkies interlocked in the sign of the tiger. Mizu Bunshin no Jutsu. Water from the koi pond rose up, amorphous, before triplicating the form of the leaf native. Han turned again to face the three duplicates as they charged him, a smirk hidden by his armored mask. He blocked each punch and kick they threw at him, not out of fear of harm. His armor would soak any weak attacks, but on sheer principle. The beauty of taijutsu was that any blow delivered by a master should be, debilitating. Even without using his unrivaled strength technique, Han was an expert, and he had enough respect for the art to not dishonor it, even if that meant pretending a novice was much better than he actually was. He ducked low, almost having his height, and the real Naruto passed over his head in a flying kick. The blonde landed and turned on his heel, charging again and aiming a knee at Han's head. A black-gloved hand caught it, large fingers wrapping around the knee. Naruto let out a cry of surprise as his midair momentum was disrupted, and Han spun in place with one leg extended, steam propelling him in a circle to sweep the feet of the water clones, turning them into puddles. At the completion of his turn, he released the blonde, sending him soaring into a nearby tree. Naruto managed to right himself in midair, sticking to the tree trunk with chakra. Han watched as the boy's blue eyes flickered over to the koi pond. Go ahead, he offered, though his deep voice lacked any sincere geniality. That's the intended purpose of this exercise, is it not? Your taijutsu abilities certainly won't win you this fight. Will ninjutsu make you competitive? I'm just getting started. The blonde proclaimed, hands forming seals. Suiton, Shigure. Fist-sized orbs of water rose from the pond and shot towards the armored shinobi. The Iwanin set himself, gloved fists punching and slicing through the incoming spheres with targeted precision. Droplets of water splashed across his armor with each broken bullet, a drizzle that seemed to clean the dust of travel from each protective red plate. There was a flash of orange as the younger boy flung himself forward, using the water release drizzle as cover. Han snorted. How predictable. He reached out, quick as a viper, and grabbed the boy by the throat. Naruto let out a choked noise and scrabbled to force the giant to release him, fingers clawing fruitlessly against the rock shinobi's black glove. His feet kicked out to strike the IWA knee, but the steam user held him out far enough that they only hit air. Han brought his weight to bear, prepared to bury the boy in the ground. A ball of sand entered his vision and exploded with a small burst of air. On reflex, he released the blonde, his dominant hand coming up to shield his eyes from the tiny projectiles. Naruto hit the ground with a muffled oof and took the opportunity to distance himself from his opponent. Han blinked several times to assure himself that no grit had gotten into his eyes, and when his senses told him he was fine, he fixed his brown-eyed stare straight ahead. I commend your honor for not attacking. I've told ya to take advantage of your enemy's weakness. Rashi criticized. But you, he continued, brown eyes flickering to settle on the redhead who had taken up station at the blonde side, who are you to intercede in another man's fight? Where is your honor? I am earning it, the redhead replied in a measured monotone, brow furrowed, and Naruto is important. His voice was dry and coarse, a perfect match to the desert Han assumed he hailed from. You do not respect that, the armored shinobi snorted. And you do? Respect, like honor, is earned. It is a long lesson, the Sunanin agreed obliquely. Gaara. Naruto breathed, blue eyes wide with surprise. So everyone has a teacher, Han growled. Let's see if you've actually learned anything. He settled himself into a defensive position. Come at me, both of you. With a gesture, a thin stream of sand shot out of the gourd on the redhead's back. Han held out a palm, scattering the silica with barely a thought, then used his other hand to block the incoming punch Naruto tried to deliver to his stomach. The individual sand streams he'd scattered angled back, wrapping around his forearm and creating a band that restrained his arm against his body. He clenched his other fist, engulfing Naruto's hand in his own, and lifted the boy off the ground. He motioned to slam the boy into the earth. A flicker of a memory hit him, Rashi's form superimposing itself over the blonde's, an ironic case of the student taking after his teacher, but Naruto wrapped his legs around the larger man's bicep and clung to his arm like a monkey. Sand continued to wind its way around his body, slithering down his arm, across his waist, and moving to bind his legs together. Naruto took advantage of the giant's distraction, wriggling free and positioning himself so that he was sitting on the Iwanin's shoulders, legs clenched around his neck. Though his armor protected him, he could feel the pressure from both the boy on his back and the granules restricting his movement as they tried to force him into submission. Unlikely. Steam built within his armor and then seeped out from between the individual plates. Strength augmented by the vapor, he flexed against his bindings. The sand bindings burst, scattering silica in every direction. He reached back and grabbed Naruto by the scruff of his jacket, plucking the boy from his perch with no effort. The blonde lashed out wildly, aiming for his opponent's head, and his foot caught the brim of Han's kasa, knocking it from his head. Annoyed by the sudden exposure of the gobi's mark, Han threw the struggling boy with impressive force, his only intention to get him away. Naruto's body broke through the tree it hit and kept going. Gaara's head turned to follow his companion's flight, and Han darted forward with a few thunderous steps. He stopped just shy of the boy, elbow extended in a strike to his chest. The redhead's trajectory followed his friend's, though Gaara was low enough to the ground that he hit the broken stump of the tree that Naruto had destroyed. Sand sprayed outward at the point of impact, and Han could see the boy's teal eyes widen as the silica spread out to form a concave shell at his back. Mother, he whispered, awestruck. His hands twitched at his sides, and the sand undulated in response to his movements. Han arched an eyebrow as the Sunanin seemed to ignore him in favor of experimenting with the sand. He walked over to where his kasa had been knocked off and picked it up. There was a poof of smoke, and he was suddenly holding Naruto instead. The blonde pulled back his leg and slammed his foot into the surprised giant's chin. Han staggered backwards and stumbled over an uneven piece of earth, falling onto his back. Yeah, gotcha. His position reminded him of how Rashi had beaten him back in the Valley of Fog, and another flash of irritation coursed through him. A blast of steam burst from his chest plate, blowing the boy's spiky hair backwards and temporarily blinding him. Han reached up and wrapped his hand around the blonde's neck, eliciting a choked gurgle. He lifted his head to glare into wide blue eyes, noting darkly, "Your celebration is premature." He again tried to slam the boy into the earth next to him, but sand wrapped around his forearm and stopped the motion. Brown eyes found Gaara standing where he'd fallen, both hands extended to control the silica. Han strained against the resistance, not yet tapping into his unrivaled strength, but the sand solidified under him, creating a plinth between his arm and the ground. "No," insisted the redhead in a firm monotone. Han grunted. "If you insist." He pitched his arm forward instead, and Naruto again went soaring, this time towards Gaara. The sand rushed to protect the redhead but couldn't outpace the airborne blonde, and the two collided in a tumble of limbs. The Iwa hoisted himself to his feet, and while the two boys disentangled themselves, he leaped into the air and crashed down on them with a grunted, "Funkoto." Naruto managed to roll to the side to avoid the falling giant, but the layer of sand that Gaara erected between him and Han tore like wet paper. Han saw the Suna Jinchūriki's teal eyes widen in shock as his feet impacted the boy's torso. The redhead's skin seemed to fracture was the best word he could think of, at the impact, and to the boy's credit, he didn't scream, though the choked sound that escaped him was probably close enough. Although, he supposed, having 250 pounds of muscle and metal drop on one's lungs tended to rob one of speech. "Suetun, Misurappa." Han withstood the wild water wave without even glancing at the blonde using it. Instead, he stared down at Gaara and asked with an air of arrogance, "Do you regret intervening? The difference in our strengths is too great for you to overcome with your piddling respect. I will get stronger." Gaara whispered, every syllable a wheezy struggle. Before he could reply, bubbles floated into his view, right at chest height, and then he heard a snap of fingers and shouted, "Suetun, Hamitsu no Jutsu." The spheres exploded, and the blast was strong enough to force him off the Sunanin. He glanced over to find Utakata staring at him, some sort of narrow rod held in one hand. "Don't you think you're going a little too far?" the brunette asked. His voice was hard, an insinuation that he already knew the answer and was merely trying to be diplomatic. He snorted in response. "If you think this is too much, you're not cut out to be a Jinchūriki. We were created to give and take beatings. Training takes time," Utakata shot back, "and they're clearly not as experienced as you are. I was under the impression that Kiri didn't pamper its shinobi." "I'm not pampered," the brunette retorted, visibly annoyed, "I just don't see the purpose in breaking someone beyond the point they can recover." Han gestured outwardly with open palms, almost shrugging. "They've survived this long as Jinchūriki, I don't see how a little more will irreparably harm them. If you disagree, you're more than welcome to stop me. But you'll need more than words to do so." Utakata's annoyed look settled on Rashi for a moment. The redhead arched an eyebrow. "He ain't wrong. IWA," came the irked reply. He turned away from the lava user, golden eyes flickering around to find Gaara making his way to his feet and Naruto moving back to stand beside the younger redhead. Both of them had their sights fixed on the armored shinobi, and the brunette's annoyance grew at the knowledge that the pair of Iwanin were right. With a terse, "Fine," he divested himself of his blue kimono and stalked towards the giant. Han tilted his head in observation of the approaching mist shinobi, a slow, unseen smirk spreading across his lips. "So you're more than a spectator, HM?" Utakata responded by raising his bubble blower to his lips and expelling another stream of bubbles. Han aimed a palm at the incoming spheres and expelled a burst of boiling vapor from his armor, evaporating them in an instant. "Find a new trick." The brunette spewed forth a wild water wave in return, the liquid tinged a pale green. Han held up his hand to forestall the attack as he'd done with Naruto's, but the moment it hit his glove, the acrid smell and burning hiss of dissolving leather struck him. He grunted in annoyance and began to run around the courtyard to avoid the stream of caustic fluid, brown eyes watching the other Jinchūriki. Gaara's arms were stretched out, and a stream of sand shot through the air towards the giant, trying to catch him in a pincer movement. Han timed it until he'd nearly been caught before darting off at a right angle so that the two elements collided. Naruto intercepted his path with a knee aimed for his chin. The Gobi Jinchūriki caught the blow easily and then lifted his other arm to block the kunai coming down on his head. Blue eyes winced as wrist met metal, and Han took the momentary pause to hold the boy's knee and deliver an uppercut to his sternum, sending him airborne and away. The pop of something at his back prompted him to turn, but he found his movement restricted. Green slime kept his limbs glued to his body like thick webbing, his feet pasted to the ground. A ball of sand about a foot in diameter shot forward and slammed into his stomach with enough force that he could feel it through his armor. Then the ball changed into a claw that wrapped around his upper body and began squeezing. The pressure wasn't immediately apparent, more like a limp handshake, but in any other scenario, against any other person, Han knew it would have been dangerous, likely deadly. He threw his head back and laughed, a deep, echoing noise of amusement. The Iwa felt an excited energy flood his veins, a shot of adrenaline born from the closest thing to happiness he'd experienced in a long time. This fight was fun. No stakes, nothing to prove, just entertainment. So this is what it comes to, he announced. Steam billowed from the furnace on his back, a thick, white haze that engulfed the area in suffocating humidity. A triple team attack where only one of you uses taijutsu. It hardly seems fair. This is Kirigakure no Jutsu, came Utakata's confused voice. He was no longer visible within the steam, but the armored shinobi could sense his position in the vapor regardless. But you're from Iwa. The green slime lost its viscosity and melted into a puddle at his feet. The sand restraining him lost its cohesion and loosened enough for him to flex and break it into clumps of soggy silica. He shot off at an angle and then pivoted to charge in Utakata's direction. The brunette turned towards him at the last second, surprise painted across his face, and the giant delivered an underhanded hammer blow to the teenager's stomach. Utakata was lifted bodily off his feet and sent hurtling through the mist, creating a hole in his wake that quickly filled in with swirling vapor. The Kirinin taken care of, Han turned on his heels and ran towards where he could sense Gaara, his armored footsteps like thunder. Naruto appeared like a bolt of lightning, steam billowing past him as he dropped from the heavens with an axe kick. Han barely managed to raise an arm perpendicularly to catch the assault, the force of the blow resonating through his armor. For a moment, their eyes met, and the Iwa could see a fierce, unyielding fire in the younger male's gaze. Humph. He found himself amused by the boy's spirit. He'd never had such passion, just burning hatred and anger and tacit acceptance of his circumstances, and here was this nobody child, struggling against odds he couldn't possibly hope to overcome. With an outward motion, he flung the blonde away from him, and as Naruto went sailing back through the steam, he flipped through hand seals and unleashed a great fireball technique at the motionless giant. Han clapped his hands together, a gust of steam emanating outwards and extinguishing the incoming flames. Sand reached for him through the vapor, and Han jumped off the ground, steam bursting from his furnace to propel him forward. Fungo Kyaku. His eruption kick broken through the sand in his path like it wasn't there. He caught a brief flash of Gaara's wide-eyed expression before his momentum carried him into the boy, sending the redhead rocketing backwards beyond the shroud of fog. He couldn't sense Naruto's presence in the steam, which meant he was likely still airborne. Yotan, Yanami. Han sidestepped the incoming wave of lava and launched himself into the air so that he was behind the falling blonde. He wrapped one arm around the boy's upper body, pinning his arms to his sides, and brought the struggling leaf native back to the ground. When they landed, the Iwa placed his free hand on the back of the blonde's head and gruffly ordered, "Yield." He could feel the younger Jinchūriki struggling in his grasp, so he tightened his hold and applied a little more pressure to the boy's head. Naruto seemed to realize his circumstances, for he let out an annoyed groan and went slack. Han released both him and his control over the surrounding steam after several more seconds, and a moment after the blonde touched the ground amidst the dissipating mists, he straightened up and flashed the Iwa a wide smile. "You're pretty strong, Han-san," he finished cheerily. He hurried away as the vapors finished clearing, returning moments later with the older Jinchūriki's red kasa in his hands. Han took the proffered hat and set it on his head. It felt like a peace offering from the loser of a fight, which was counterintuitive to every battle, physical or verbal, he'd ever fought. He watched the boy hurry over to Gaara, who was steadily working his way to his feet. I can't figure him out either." He glanced down to find Rashi had sidled up beside him while his attention was focused elsewhere. The redhead's gaze was fixed on the pair of younger demon containers, his arms crossed over his chest. "He's got your fingerprints all over him." Rashi shrugged. Yeah, I've been trainin' him. Yotan's new. Kid's impressive, that's fair sure. Silence fell between the pair of rock shinobi as Naruto seemed to talk at Gaara, their conversation too far to overhear. "He's still unpolished. Follies, oh, youth." The giant's brown eyes flickered to the left, where Utakata was hobbling over to them. There was a noticeable bruise forming around his stomach. Your form is awful. Ah, well, my physicality is not my strength, the brunette admitted. On the other hand, yours is impressive. Which is probably an understatement. I didn't know anyone outside of Kiri could fight using Kirigakure no Jutsu. I don't know what you're talking about. The style is my own. The gift of my curse, he spat. Utakata was quiet for a long moment. Han felt like he could hear the gears in the bubble user's brain turning. He seemed like an introspective kind of person. I won't pretend to know your life, the brunette said quietly, but I felt cursed, too. I think that's what being a Jinchūriki is. But being here has helped relieve that burden, just a little. Maybe it'll help you, too, if you'd let it. Han didn't respond, though he could admit to himself that the same feeling, a weight easing off his chest, even fractionally, had come over him when Orochimaru's name had fallen from Jiraiya's lips. It had felt so good, a cool breeze in the searing desert, a moment all too rare in a life engulfed by scorching anger and hate. For the first time since he'd escaped his cell as a child, he felt just a smidgen of freedom. He smirked to himself, only a little sour. Damn it, Rashi, how do you always manage to get your way? Your taijutsu needs work, he called out to Naruto. Both the blonde and redhead turned their heads to face him, one expression curious, the other blank. Rashiaji's taught me a lot. Rashi's taijutsu sucks, too, retorted the giant. Behind him, the Yonbi Jinchūriki cleared his throat, audibly annoyed. If you train seriously and properly, you can beat him easily. If you're interested, he offered with casual disinterest. He could see the blonde's eyes light up. Really? Yeah, that's awesome. Gaara took a step closer. His face retained its blank facade, but there was hesitation in his posture. Han had seen the same hesitation in enemies who'd watched him tear through their comrades on the battlefield. I would like to be trained as well, he intoned slowly, if you are willing. Of course he's willing. Naruto proclaimed. You'll help Gaara, too, right Han-san? Your taijutsu is non-existent, Han told the boy, ignoring the blonde's request. Gaara's shoulders seemed to slump another fraction, an imperceptible motion. But if you're willing, then I don't see why not. The Sunanin's head rose to meet the giant's, teal eyes wide with a surprise that was more genuine and innocent than any of his mid-fight shock. If the offer is open, I'll take you up on that as well, Utakata interjected. This bandwagon is getting rather full, Han groused. And mine's easing up, Rashi said with a laugh. Except for the Yotan. Rashi sighed. Yeah, got me there. So kid, when ya figure out Yotan? Han watched as the older Iwa-nin and Utakata moved towards where Naruto had started excitedly talking about the source of his lava release abilities. They seemed very natural, he mused. It reminded him of how Kuratsuchi, Akatsuki, and Deidara had gotten along, or how Kuratsuchi had always seemed to flourish under Rashi's attention in the rare instances he visited Iwa proper. Considering that he'd also been tutored by Inoki, he'd never understood how the younger trio had always remained so upbeat, but watching the other Jinchūriki now, he thought maybe he had an inkling. He was interrupted from his musing by a muffled clanking as something reverberated against his armor. He reached into an inside pocket of his GI and withdrew a rounded river rock. The kanji 4-5, engraved neatly into the stone, was alight with orange-red heat, and the entire rock vibrated in his hand. What is it? A call to action, Inoki replied. I'll use it to summon you if you're needed. Han snorted. The whole stone was barely as big as his palm. It appeared inconsequential despite the responsibility it carried. And if I break it? The Tsuchikage laughed, though it was void of amusement. The will of stone is not so easily destroyed. You'll find it much more difficult than you think. Annoyingly, the old man had been correct. The stone was aggravatingly indestructible. He tried mostly out of an effort to prove Inoki wrong, and had been disappointed each time. Though he doubted it was the will of stone that Tsuchikage spoke of, more likely seals placed by the same people who had been smart enough to seal a Bijū into a child, it was annoying nonetheless. Every time that Tsuchikage had called him, he'd responded. It was the duty of a Jinchūriki, of an Iwa-nin, to do so. Han stared at the rock for a long moment before returning it to his GI. As he'd told the Sannin, he was no true Iwa-nin. He finally had a lead on the man who'd ruined his life, and he was enjoying a second helping of long overdue freedom. Eat dirt, old man. Chapter 13, The Fox's Synergy. Alright, Uzumaki Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke, you're next. Both boys stepped into the circle that represented the limits of the sparring ring and glared at each other. Their teacher, Yumino Irika, glanced between them, expression stern. "Come on now," he demanded, a tinge of exasperation in his tone, "you two have done this enough times to know what's expected. Each spar begins with the seal of confrontation." Glares frozen in place, the two 10-year-olds brought their right arms up, lifting their pointer and middle fingers so the tips were even with their chins. Irika nodded in acknowledgement. "Good. Now. Begin." Naruto shouted, rushing the dark-haired boy. Sasuke didn't move, waiting until the blonde was almost upon him before ducking a straight jab and throwing an uppercut into the charging boy's stomach. Naruto gasped, and Sasuke followed up by slamming his fist into the boy's jaw, followed by a flip kick that laid him out on his back, trying to catch his breath. "Well done, Sasuke," Irika praised. "Now, come together and make the seal of reconciliation." "Not a chance." Naruto snapped hoarsely, finding his voice again. "That bastard cheated, I know it, Naruto!" Irika shouted, temper flaring. "You lost because you can't read the flow of battle. Blindly attacking your opponent is not the way to win. Now make the seal of reconciliation with Sasuke." "Screw that. Detention." Naruto stuck his tongue out at his teacher, eyebrows furrowed in a scowl. Punishment or not, anything was better than admitting defeat to the stuck-up Uchiha. "I'll show you one day," he swore. "You'll see. So kid, how goes the training?" Jiraiya's sudden interruption caused his chakra to flare, and the spherical balloon he held in his right hand blew apart. "Ah, come on. Still having trouble, eh?" "Not everyone can keep it up for long periods of time." There was a sly tone in the older man's voice that felt icky, so the blonde decided to ignore whatever he was trying to imply. After what seemed like weeks of Jiraiya being too busy for him, he could finally ask for advice. "I don't get it, Jiraiya-sensei," Naruto admitted, trying and failing to disguise the annoyed whine in his voice. "What am I doing wrong?" "Ah, well, that's for you to figure out on your own," the Sannin advised in a tone implying sage wisdom, as is honored tradition. "Minato didn't offer me any advice when I learned, and he spent 3 years creating it on his own. The struggle is part of the journey." Naruto frowned at him for his uselessness, but then his expression became pensive. Minato. He'd heard that name before, and in an important context, but... "What's the matter, kid? You look confused as I've ever seen you." "Minato," he replied absently, voice quiet. Minato," he repeated louder. "It sounds familiar, but I can't think of where I've heard it before." His brows knit further together in a tight V as he racked his brain. History was never something he'd paid close attention to, barring the stories about the fourth Hokage, and, oh, he's my dad. And suddenly his excitement at remembering why the name was so significant flowed over into what he was learning. "You're teaching me my dad's jutsu." Jiraiya looked, well, gobsmacked was probably the right word. He'd seen the same expression on Utakata's face a handful of times during training, and Rashi had called it that. "How do you know that?" "Oh, Rashiaji and Utakata and I told me when we met." For how much he'd struggled to recall it, the memory was suddenly clear in his mind's eye. Utakata had been telling him about Jinchūriki and Bijū, about how the story of the Yondame's defeat of the Kyuubi was a fairy tale invented by the Hidden Leaf's higher-ups, and then they'd told him not to tell anyone. Aw crap. Well, there was no going back at this point. And Jiraiya had apparently learned from the fourth. He couldn't remember if the white-haired man had mentioned that during their travels, but if he had, it had likely escaped his attention at the time. It wouldn't now. "Did you know the Yondame?" he asked, his body practically vibrating with excitement. "What was he like? Did you know my mom, too? What was she like?" "Whoa, slow down, kid," Jiraiya said, holding a hand up to forestall the blonde's rapid-fire questions. "One at a time. Let's see, where to begin," he mused, pointer finger tapping his chin in thought. "Well, Minato was a natural genius, learned everything I taught him quick as a flash. Not that that's how he got his nickname, but it was definitely applicable to more than just the battlefield." "I don't care about that stuff," Naruto interrupted, "I want to know what they were like." His blue eyes were beseeching, desperate with a longing for knowledge he'd been denied for too many years. The corner of Jiraiya's mouth quirked slightly, brown eyes softening with fondness. "Fair enough. Well, your dad was one of the bravest people I knew, and he always fought to defend the people he cared about. When he and your mom were genin, some Kimonin kidnapped her, and Minato tracked them down by following strands of hair she'd left behind and rescued her. I guess it was quite the romantic gesture, the Sannin added with a smirk. Her hair? Naruto asked, again ignoring the older man's sly aside. Your mom had beautiful, long, straight red hair, like a ripe tomato. It was a really common trait among the Uzumaki, and it caught your dad hook, line, and sinker. Naruto frowned. But, I'm an Uzumaki, and I don't have red hair. He ran a hand through his blonde locks as if to drive home the point, expression morose. Such a distinctive trait of his family, and he hadn't gotten it. Feels kinda like I don't belong. Jiraiya placed a hand atop the boy's head, drawing blue eyes back to him, and ruffled the spiky strands. Win some, lose some, kid. If it's any consolation, you're a lot like her. Naruto's head cocked to the side, silently asking for him to elaborate. You both act before thinking things through, you're stubborn, you never shut up, and you both get really animated when you think you know best. Which, by the way, is way too often. The blonde rubbed beneath his nose with a finger, eyes closed and grin wide, clearly embarrassed. Really? Oh yeah. Thanks to her temper and her hair, everyone used to call her the red hot-blooded habanero. You have her face, you know. Minato's eyes and hair, of course, but everything else is all Kushina. Except your loyalty, that you get from both of them. He patted the boy on the head, offering him a wide smile. They loved you with everything they had. Never forget that. Why did they? He swallowed the question, hesitation nakedly written across his face. If they loved me, why did they put the Kyuubi inside me? Why does everyone else hate me? Ah! Jiraiya's jovial expression fell, solemnity in every feature. That I can't answer. Not being here when the Kyuubi attacked is one of my greatest regrets. Rashiaji and Utakata and I said that Jinchūriki are chosen so they'll be loyal to the village. They probably have a point. Other villages, no, sorry, all the villages see Jinchūriki as weapons, and every Kage is responsible for seeing that their village is protected as it can be. Even Konoha, he paused, took a shuddering breath, and continued, I've seen your seal, Naruto, and it's different from your mom's. She was the Jinchūriki before you. The Sannin pushed past his student's open-mouthed shock, trying to explain as much as he could before he was interrupted. No, I don't know why she was chosen, and I can't explain what Konoha was thinking, but I know for a fact that Minato and Kushina would never have done what they did if they didn't think you could handle it. Minato, he trusted you with a power that even Kushina never had. Most Jinchūriki simply contain their Bijū, maybe tap into the Bijū's attributes, but your seal is meant to allow you to use the Kyuubi's power as your own, transform it directly into strength. I knew Minato, and he wouldn't have done that unless it was completely necessary. He loved the village, and would have done anything to protect it, but he loved you and your mom so much more. If you could have seen him when he told me he was gonna be a dad. Jiraiya shook his head, grinning to himself. Kid, the words don't exist to convey how happy he was. I hope one day you're able to understand that feeling. Maybe then you'll understand what they did. Naruto sniffled, using his sleeve to wipe his face. Jiraiya was pointedly watching a nearby pair of birds, allowing the blonde a moment of privacy. When he was once more in control of himself, the blonde asked, Do you think so? But Sakura-chan never wants to go out with me. Ah, one of those girls. The older man turned a grin toward his student. You know, Tsunade was much the same with me when we were growing up. And now look at us. Doesn't she hate you? There's a very thin line between love and hate, kid. At the blonde's confused look, he coughed and added, But, it's possible that you're barkin' up the wrong tree. Naruto frowned at that, the idea somehow unfathomable. You're young, you've got time. Maybe try focusing on your ninjutsu first, and when you finally figure out the Rasengan, then you can figure out how to treat yourself to a reward. Naruto blinked. Reward? Jiraiya let out a long-suffering sigh, shaking his head with a bemused chuckle. Ah, so naive. You'll learn someday. It feels like it's talking forever, the blonde grumbled. That might be the case, but good things come to those who wait. At Naruto's annoyed scowl, the Sannin let out an amused snort. Ha, you're still full of spirit. That's good. Remember that when you go up against someone who thinks they're better than you. I always did, And look where I am now. Naruto eyed the older man speculatively, measuring his worth. Yeah, he agreed slowly, deeming his, sometimes, teacher to be a worthwhile role model. Yeah, okay. So what's next? Keep practicing. And when the time comes, I'll help you beat down the Kyuubi worse than Minato did. What about now? You have other things to work on now, Jiraiya pointed out, and there are plenty of people better suited than me to teach you those things. When you're ready, we'll start working on getting you to the next level. In the meantime, good things come to those who wait. Naruto let out a huff, but then held out his hand palm up. Jiraiya tossed him another round balloon, and the blonde's attention fixed itself on the sphere. Tongue poking out from between his teeth, chakra swirling within the balloon, he could feel. Bang! Damn it, take a ready stance. Naruto planted his feet and angled his body so his left side was forward, knees bent slightly and arms cocked at chest height with fists curled. His periphery caught Gaara, standing several feet to his left, glance at him and ape his posture. Han snorted, and only months of dealing with Rashi made the blonde think that it reflected bemusement more than anything else. You've really never thrown a punch, have you? I thought I was being hyperbolic, but apparently not. It was not necessary before, the redhead noted, seemingly unaffected by the Iwanin's analysis. It is now. I require help. Clearly, Han deadpanned. Who makes it through the academy without becoming even slightly proficient at taijutsu? He groused. Gaara opened his mouth to respond, but the giant held up a hand to forestall him. No, don't answer that, it was rhetorical. Do you not understand inflection? No. Fantastic. Well, you can relax for now. If we're starting from scratch, I'm not teaching you Rashi's shitty taijutsu. Naruto watched the redhead relax back into a stiff standing position, his teal eyes never leaving the armored shinobi. It wasn't obvious, but Gaara's stoicism seemed different somehow. A week ago, his monotone had been angry, even desperate. His tone when he'd accused Naruto of lying to him had been so fraught with the insinuation of Naruto's complicity that the blonde had expected him to lash out, threaten to kill him, a reversion to the boy who'd been grudgingly dragged across the land of fire in search of a woman he couldn't care less about. But now he seemed calm. Well, he always kind of came off that way, but now it felt more like he didn't know how to describe it. Gaara wasn't grumpy like Rashi or gentle like Utakata, or even casually ambivalent like some of his friends back at the academy. Most of the time he was just present. Watching. It might have felt invasive if the redhead was even aware of how he came off to others. But the weight of the Sunanin's stare felt judgmental. He always seemed to listen, but he never seemed to hear, to understand. Whatever was going on in the Sunanin's head, he hadn't expected the other boy to interfere in his fight with Han. The idea that he was maybe getting through to the Sand Genin sent a shiver of hope down his spine. He'd been trying since before they'd even been formally introduced to get the redhead on his side. On their side, the alliance of Jinchūriki that Utakata had told him was so important without really explaining why. After Rashi and Utakata had taken him into their confidence and doted on him full-time, it was gratifying to finally be able to contribute to their mission. He squirmed with excitement at the thought, and the movement drew Han's scrutiny, his pupil-less brown eyes seeming to judge him. At least you're centered well, he noted gruffly. Well, Rashiaji's a pretty tough sensei. I wouldn't know, the Iwanin snapped. Naruto visibly startled at Giant's tone, and Han slipped his right hand beneath his gi and closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. After several seconds, he opened his eyes and fixed the blonde with a hard stare. What he put you through will pale in comparison to this. If it hadn't been for the months of training with Rashi, who had presented all the same rough edges and intimidation tactics that Han now seemed to be employing, Naruto might have paused at the armored shinobi's warning. As it was, listening to Han try to scare him didn't seem all that different from every other day of training with his fellow Jinchūriki. Bring it on, Han-san, I can take it. Humph. You've got guts, kid, I'll give you that. Naruto grinned. Jiraiya said that to him a lot, and it always sounded like a compliment. What exactly are you planning on doing to him? Han turned his head so he could see Utakata, who was sitting near the koi pond, watching them all. Train him in taijutsu, like I said. Don't you have any methods that aren't just an excuse to beat someone else up? Taijutsu is learned through exchanging blows. The Iwanin's tone allowed no argument. The boy doesn't have a problem with my methods, why do you? I don't believe that beating someone until they break is how to train someone. I've seen what it does to the shinobi of Kiri. Turn them into whiny cowards, by my estimate, Han interjected. Utakata and I can do this. The brunette turned to the blonde and offered him a tentative smile. It's not that you can't. I just think there's a better way. He returned his attention to Han and asked, can't you teach him Futon? He knows Suiton and Katan, and I've seen what Futon specialists can do in Kiri. He is already being taught ninjutsu, the Iwa argued, and if you couldn't tell, my specialty does not focus on utilizing Futon like others might. He grabbed his left forearm with his right hand clenched into a fist, and rotated it, appearing to prepare for a fight. If he wishes to learn how to use Futon as I do, then he'll need this. The plates of his armor clinked with every move, a mocking chorus of applause. In the meantime, a proper punch is the best he can hope for. You're so defeatist, Utakata replied quietly. Futon is more than what you use it for. I'm telling you, I've seen it before. Then perhaps you have something worthwhile to teach after all, Han grunted, and I leave his Futon training in your capable hands. Until then, if you're so afraid for the boy, you can serve as his punching bag. Ah! You sought to learn as well, did you not? Han posed, sarcasm dripping from every word. This way should alleviate any concerns that he will not be harmed while also teaching you. Is that not a win-win? Utakata stood with a sigh. You Iwa certainly have a way about you. Han made a noise that might have been a grunt of agreement. You're a fool if you thought I was going to fight him again as a first lesson. How can I effectively correct his taijutsu if I'm the target of his strikes? But you, the brunette spluttered. You were the presumptuous one, the armored shinobi accused. Rashi and I are not the same. I do not appreciate the implication that we are. Utakata had the fair grace to look ashamed. Ah! My apologies. Another grunt, Han's brown eyes following the Kirinin as he took his place across from Naruto. The blonde's eyes finally stopped ping-ponging between the arguing pair, settling on the brunette teenager before him. Utakata had always been a little protective of him, and in the beginning, Naruto had appreciated his intervention because Rashi had been difficult, and having someone who seemed to actually like him, especially after having dealt with the villagers' dislike, was nice. But then Rashi's attitude had decreased from a rolling boil to a low simmer, and the youngest Jinchūriki had gotten used to his training, and the brunette's need to provide a buffer had faded. Now though, there were new people, new Jinchūriki. He thought excitedly, and the whole process was starting anew, except this time, Naruto knew what to expect. Or, well, mostly. Han had just said he wasn't Rashi, and he supposed it wasn't fair to compare the two, even if their training and attitudes so far seemed pretty much the same. Either way, after months of training day in and day out, slowly growing stronger and being able to see the results, he was glad for every opportunity to learn something new, to keep pushing himself. How else was he going to become the strongest Hokage? Which made it so weird that Utakata was back to being defensive. It had been his idea to train the blonde in the first place, so it stood to reason that anything that could be done to make him stronger was a good thing. And Naruto had already proven he could take whatever the older Jinchūriki could dish out, so the brunette's hesitation felt misplaced. Maybe it had something to do with his friend Yagura. It wouldn't have been the first time the Kirinin had been cagey about something because of his past, and bringing up the absent Mizukichi was a surefire way to throw the bubble user off his game, though Naruto didn't fully understand why. Yagura was special, that much he knew. To be both a Jinchūriki and a Kage. That alone made him an inspiration to the blonde, and they'd never even met. But to know that there was someone else like him, burdened by something beyond his control, who had risen through the ranks to become the leader of his village, a figure revered by those he protected, and someone Utakata looked up to, was all he needed to know. He'd always admired the fourth Hokage, but knowing the man was gone and being unable to meet his hero was discouraging. That was even more true now with the knowledge that the man was his father. But he had a chance to actually meet Yagura and learn how he'd become such a great Kage, and to do that, he was willing to do whatever it took. Of course, when that would happen was anyone's guess, since whatever danger Yagura was in still existed. That was probably why Utakata always seemed so jumpy, he reasoned. Blue eyes wide with wonder watched the brunette. Who can threaten a Kage, though? Neither Utakata nor Rashi were very forthcoming with any details, and they'd kept him too busy to think of asking. Maybe a Bijū? He mused, thinking of his father, or even his own fight against Gaara. Quit daydreaming. Naruto looked up, his neck craning uncomfortably far back to meet Han's hard eyes. I was just thinking. Which apparently requires significant effort. Naruto scowled in response, biting his tongue to stop a verbal retort. Rashi liked to jab him with little insults as well, and Naruto had learned, although not always remembered, that not reacting deprived the redhead of the enjoyment he got from riling him up. Han apparently didn't care, for he continued with a gesture at Utakata, attack him like he's an enemy, and we'll go from there. The blonde hesitated for a moment, but Utakata bobbed his head once, lips quirked as if to say it was okay, and so he charged forward. HRK. His back hit the ground, hard. Something had grabbed the scruff of his collar mid-step and yanked, momentarily choking off his airway and laying him supine. Han appeared in his vision immediately, shaking his head. Do you always do exactly what you're told, without ever questioning it? No. And yet you were going to charge into a fight against a clearly superior opponent with no plan. You told me to. Han arched an eyebrow, and Naruto realized the contradiction with his previous question. Oh. He rose to his feet, one hand rubbing at his throat where his jacket had choked him. So what am I supposed to do? Before you run headlong into a battle, you analyze your opponent to the best of your ability. He is older, bigger, and stronger than you, Han listed, which means that you are automatically disadvantaged in a physical battle. And that's without knowing that he can cover his skin with acid. The giant turned to Utakata. Your abilities are similar to Rashi's, I don't see why you don't just have him train you. Utakata coughed, admitting almost sheepishly, I tried. He's very resistant to helping others. Han snorted, sounding wryly amused. Yes, I'm aware. Some things never change. Rashiaji trained me, Naruto pointed out, mildly offended by the slight to his teacher. Unless or until you wield Yotan like he does, what he taught you is inefficient. The reason it works for Rashi is because a touch is debilitating. Same for your friend over there, he added with a jerk of his head towards Utakata. Perhaps he taught you how to fight, but this is taijutsu, which involves analyzing your situation and countering or attacking as appropriate. You are small and inexperienced, charging blindly into battle is stupid. I'm not. He began, heated refusal in every syllable, but something in the giant's description gave him pause. A memory struck him, a younger version of himself running at Uchiha Sasuke while their classmates and teacher watched, a fist raised to telegraph his assault, and in the next moment, him flat on his back on the ground, the wind knocked out of his lungs. If it had been once or twice, he might have brushed it off, but now that he thought about it, every spar against Sasuke had ended similarly. And it wasn't just Sasuke. Aburame Shino, Inazuka Kiba, Mochizuki Minoji, he'd never really beaten any of them in the academy spars, and his approach had always been the same, attack, 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 never think. He nodded slowly, more to himself than to the Iwa-nin, but then locked eyes with the armored shinobi. Yeah, I think I get it. It didn't hurt as much as it used to in the beginning, to admit he didn't know everything, that his new teachers actually had something worthwhile to impart to him. He'd always said he was the greatest, would be the best Hokage, and carrying that boast around gave him a sort of intrinsic self-worth that he didn't actually need anything the academy taught him. And Irika's focus on book learning certainly hadn't helped in trying to impart a wisdom Naruto had already been reluctant to learn. So it made sense that, as Rashi and Utakata had focused their attention on him, sometimes using him as a painful example in their lessons, he'd taken that knowledge with the bittersweet realization that he was not nearly as good as he thought himself. But he was getting better. That was enough to temper the boasts that burned in his mouth, the falsehoods of his own greatness, globules of lava he wanted to spit out but was forced to swallow instead and accept that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as great as he thought himself, though he one day would be. Han grunted. Good. He turned to look at Utakata, and with a jerk of his head toward the blonde, said, You, attack him. You'll defend and seek an opening to counterattack, he told Naruto. Begin when ready. Utakata charged and Naruto waited, looking for the movement that would belly the brunette's first strike. So how's your trainin' going? Good. Naruto's voice was high with cheer, and Rashi quickly quashed the scowl of envy that any Jinchūriki could ever be so happy. Han-san says I'm learning. He made a movement the redhead's periphery vaguely attributed to the Gobi Jinchūriki's fighting style. So I see, the Iwa-nin replied with droll enthusiasm, attention focused on his clasped hands, molten magma encasing them. Rashiaji, Naruto whined. The Iwa-nin could picture the pout that adorned the leaf native's lips. You're not even watching. When you're as good as me, ya don't need ter stare ter see things. The heat shrouding his hands flared suddenly, prompting Rashi to curse aloud. What ya doin'? Enjoyin' time to myself, he grumbled. He opened his hands and found a misshapen lump of dark rock. Ah, can't believe I let ya distract me. From what? I gave your friend, Ichibi Jinchūriki something, oh, mine. Easy enough to replace with right materials and focus. He shot the blonde an annoyed look, though it lacked any real heat. Naruto nodded in understanding, though he couldn't say he really understood at all. Do you want to train? One red eyebrow arched skeptically. And what do ya think ya can teach me, eh? Not to be so grumpy all the time, he replied cheekily. Rashi looked vaguely amused in the kind of sour way Naruto had grown used to, and the blonde bit back his boast that the redhead could learn from the greatest Hokage that ever would be. It was best not to push the Four-Tails jailer too far. I mean, can you train me in Yotan? You know, since I can do it now. Rashi barked a laugh. Yeah, did it once. Twice. Naruto protested. And yeah, think that makes ya an expert? No, but that's what you're for, right? And Han's just lettin' ya ditch him. Naruto scratched the side of his head with a finger, visibly embarrassed. Well, he kinda got tired of us. Said he needed a break from Gaara, Utakata and me after bein' stuck with us for a week. Then he kinda stormed off. Sounds 'bout right, Rashi muttered. Fine, if ya want something to do, I suppose we can train. So, what do ya remember 'bout when ya used Yotan? I dunno. I was kinda mad, and out of ideas. It was the only thing I could think of that might work. Ya can do a lot when you're desperate. Ya can't rely on that though. Ya got to learn how to use it till it's like breathin'. Use it? You mean now? Now. Naruto's face scrunched together in a facsimile of pain, trying to summon a flicker of anger alongside the stubbornness that was the hallmark of Earth release. It was hard, he decided, to try to be angry when there was no reason for it. What are ya doing? The blonde opened one eye to peer at Rashi. Tryin' to get mad. None o' that, the redhead retorted, tone sharp as a kunai. Ya know how to use katan, Naruto gave a quick nod, and he continued, and ya can use doton, Naruto repeated, and then realized he sounded uncomfortably like the older Jinchūriki and said, I mean, right, then ya don't need any that emotion crap. Since chakra's physical and mental energy, we got your mental energy, your emotions, ter guide chakra nature ter start ya off. Now that ye've done it, ya should be able ter use any time. Oh, you mean like how Hansan talks about muscle memory? Something like that. He kneeled, placing a palm on the ground, and felt the roiling magma of the mantle beneath him. Its blazing heat and glacial glide of the crust above were like old friends, the only friends he'd ever known, and something deep within him felt at peace at their reunion. With a bit of earth manipulation, he summoned a chunk of sedimentary rock from the depths and into his palm. He held out his hand, gesturing for Naruto to take the rock, and the blonde reached out, recoiling when the dissipating heat proved too intense. If ya can use Yotan, ya got nothin' ter fear. Naruto steeled his resolve, reaching out and grabbing the proffered chunk with no hesitation. Warmth suffused his hand, but it was a gentle heat. Shouldn't it be hotter? He wondered. Feels good, Naruto nodded, and the redhead continued, cover it with your hands. He brought his own hands together, cupped so there was a pocket of space between them. Naruto copied the gesture, his cupped hands held before him, the rock hidden from view. If ya can turn that to a gem, ya can use Yotan. How do I do that? Heat and pressure. Katan and Doton. Naruto nodded again, blue eyes fixated on his hands, staring with such intensity that he half expected his appendages to spontaneously combust. And time, Rashi added dryly, sounding bemused. What doesn't? The blonde muttered, annoyed, thinking of how the Rasengan seemed to be permanently out of reach. Rashi clapped him on the shoulder in a rare gesture of camaraderie. Y'all get it. You're too stubborn not to. Naruto grinned at the compliment. Thanks Rashi-aji. Naruto blocked Utakata's horizontal chop, pushing the limb to the side and then striking out with a kick to the teenager's solar plexus. The brunette hopped backwards, avoiding the shorter boy's reach, and then dashed forward to take advantage of the blonde's extension. The younger Jinchūriki had already reset himself to a defensive stance, however, and he sidestepped the Kirinin's charge, laying a foot out to trip him. Utakata stumbled, but rolled with the motion, springing up several feet away before the blonde could capitalize on the moment. He bobbed his head in acknowledgement of the move, and Naruto allowed a grin to split his lips. Good maneuver. Han's deep voice was measured, even curt, but Naruto had gotten used to his observational nonchalance over the past several weeks, and he turned his bright smile to the giant. Yeah, I'm doing pretty good, huh, Han-san. The armored shinobi merely stared, brown eyes piercing, and Naruto didn't let the lack of assurance bother him. Rashi had been much the same at first, and the taller Iwa Nin was still new to the group, so the blonde figured he got a pass. If you think so, then I suppose we should make this more difficult. You may now use ninjutsu. Ah! Naruto turned to look at Utakata, who now appeared to be a little too pleased at having this restriction lifted. Suiton, Tepidama. Naruto leaped away from the incoming water ball, resorting to evasive tactics. Han had begun drilling into him to dodge the barrage of liquid projectiles Utakata sent his way. His fingers flipped through seals before he skidded to a halt and slapped his palms to the ground with a cry of, Doton, Dorika Geishi. The earthen wall that flipped up took the brunt of an incoming gunshot technique, allowing him a moment to plan his next move. His defense crumbled under the force of a hail of water, but he'd already activated the substitution technique, reappearing in a crouch several feet behind the older Jinchūriki where a rock had been. He ran at Utakata, looking to get close and knock him out with a hard blow to the back of the head. He struck a barrier 3 feet behind the brunette, struggling against something unseeable and elastic. Ha! Utakata's neck craned just enough for the blonde to see the edge of an over-the-shoulder grin, and then the bubble surrounding the teenager popped. Naruto was blown backwards by the force, though he quickly righted himself to a more favorable midair position. Han liked to say that midair was a terrible place to be without either power, like his own steam-enhanced taijutsu had, or surprise, and Naruto had neither, as his teacher had demonstrated again and again and again. A tendril of water wrapped around his ankle, and Naruto could see it stretching back to Utakata's hand. The brunette's arm jerked, and the blonde's body followed the movement, the water whip bringing him closer to its wielder. He focused chakra to his hands, resisting the urge to close his eyes in concentration. Don't lose sight of your enemy in a fight. Han criticized in his mind, and a red aura overcame the appendages. A single touch evaporated a section of the whip, freeing Naruto, and he condensed the aura surrounding his hands into small fireballs that he pitched at the Kirinin. It wasn't yet lava release. He was still struggling with how to utilize both Doton and Katan at once, and it annoyed him that he couldn't tap into the chakra muscle memory of the 2 previous instances. State o' mind, Rashi had grunted when asked, after several days of struggling with the molten rock exercise, but what he'd figured out so far was at least still useful. Utakata swung the water whip overhead, intercepting the incoming fireballs, and Naruto took the brunette's distraction as an opportunity to weave signs and expel a great fireball at him. The Kirinin noticed the incoming attack and immediately backpedaled to get out of its trajectory. Sand rose up in the path, and the fire ninjutsu dissipated harmlessly against it. Blue and golden eyes turned to find Gaara standing beside Han, arm extended towards them. The redhead appeared to stare at his outstretched limb in silent appraisal, fingers flexing experimentally and the sand mass undulating in response. If you wished to fight, you would have been better doing something offensive while they were unaware, Han observed, deep voice dispassionate. I wish to understand what I am capable of in all capacities, Gaara intoned. Teal eyes flickered towards Naruto, and for a moment, the blonde was reminded of the weight the Sunanin's heavy gaze carried, the thrill of the fight, the madness of a senseless purpose, the promise of death. But none of that seemed apparent now. In fact, his stare seemed almost docile, at least compared to how he'd used to look. There was a silent scrutiny in his teal gaze, as if he was analyzing the blonde by some internal metric Naruto was clueless to. And then the spell was broken, and Gaara's hand angled towards the blonde, the sand following his command. Hey! Naruto shouted, focus on avoiding the silica, shouldn't this be illegal or something? 2-on-1's not fair. Life isn't fair, Han retorted, and real shinobi do not obey codes of ethics in battle. You suck. Water worked last time, he thought quickly. Another round of hand signs, chakra building in his gut, and then, Suiton, Mizurappa. The wild water wave drenched the pursuing silica, and Naruto activated a body flicker to appear behind Gaara before either he or Utakata could react. Gaara wasn't good with taijutsu, so knocking him out should return the spar to 1-on-1. Gaara's arms crossed in an X behind his head, thick bracers of sand protecting his head and neck from the blonde's attempted chop. Naruto boggled at the move, a show of dexterity the Sunanin's historical body language had not suggested him capable of. The Sand Genin mule kicked him in the knee, eliciting a yelp from the blonde, who immediately grasped the injured joint. Arms free, Gaara turned on the spot and drove a fist covered in sand, coarse grains shaped into sharp points on his knuckles, into the Kyuubi Jinchūriki's cheek. Naruto barely managed to turn away from the blow, allowing his left shoulder to soak the punch and rolling away from the redhead. A blast of water struck him mid-roll, pushing him into an uncontrolled tumble over the ground. When he finally managed to slow his momentum, his knee was throbbing and his vision was spinning. I guess Hansan really taught Gaara taijutsu. Blue eyes flickered over to Utakata. And Utakata and I is still stronger than me. He wouldn't win like this. Han liked to talk about turning situations to one's advantage, which was part of why he taught reacting rather than blindly acting when working from a handicap, and Naruto was certainly there right now. He needed to disadvantage the other two Jinchūriki somehow. His fingers worked through seals, the move still a fairly new addition to his repertoire. Kirigakure no Jutsu, he muttered, a thick mist suffusing outward from him. Utakata's agape mouth disappeared from view, as did Gaara's penetrating stare, although a stream of sand still shot towards the blonde through the enshrouding haze. Naruto erected a small wall with the earth shore returned to block the incoming silica, then crawled to his feet and silently snuck away from where his opponents had last seen him, thinking of his next move. It wasn't steam, but the hiding in mist technique was the closest thing to Futon that Han was willing to teach him. If Naruto could learn to fight in low-visibility conditions, Han had lectured in one of many one-on-one training sessions, he could leverage that to his advantage in most fights, which would make up for his limited physicality and lesser taijutsu. He couldn't chakra sense through the vapor, yet. Although he'd at least become adequate at increasing his visual acuity while within the jutsu, but his penchant for escaping the consequences of pranking Konoha's villagers meant that he'd been able to adapt well to attacking stealthily, which the technique supported. Gaara had been nearest, and since the Sunanin's normal strategy involved staying still, the blonde decided it would be easiest to target him first. Naruto stalked silently to where the sand shinobi had last been standing, the mist swirling gently around him. The boy's stationary form finally appeared as a shadowy figure, and the blonde continued prowling towards the genin, eyes and ears perked for any sign of attack from either him or Utakata. Something tiny and rough hit his skin when he was 3 feet away, a tiny pinprick that was annoying rather than hurtful, and then an arm of sand shot out in his direction. Naruto dove to the side, somersaulted to his feet, and backed away from the redhead, wary. A whisper of wind next to his ear drew his attention, and the blonde's attention turned momentarily to suss out the distraction. The mist swirled marginally with the next whisper, and Naruto grinned to himself as realization struck him. Tiny sand particulates were rotating around Gaara, the redhead the eye of a localized dust devil, alerting him to any intrusion of his personal space. That was fine. If nothing else, Naruto knew how to create a distraction. 2 water clones, featureless but for their humanoid shape, formed from the surrounding vapor and snuck off through the haze. Naruto waited until the whoosh of sand attacking one of his duplicates reached his ears before rushing forward. He met no resistance, a hand dipping into his weapon's pouch as blood-red hair became visible. The leaf native slammed the handle of his kunai into Gaara's skull, eliciting a grunt from the Sunanin as he pitched forward. The redhead taken care of, Naruto crept through the mist, looking for a hint of Utakata. Pop! Naruto froze at the innocuous sound, throwing himself to the ground as a tendril of water whipped towards him. He breathed a silent sigh of relief as it passed overhead, suddenly wary of where he could move with the Kirinin's bubbles spread invisibly throughout the mist, when moisture began to soak into his clothes and wet his palms. Ha! The liquid rose quickly to smother him in a sphere of water before he could react, and Utakata stepped out of the mist with fingers holding the sign of the dog. I think that's game, he said, smiling good-naturedly. Naruto frowned, more annoyed at his own misstep than the brunette's victory, and the chakra holding the mists together dissipated, taking the hiding in mist technique with it. Don't feel bad, Naruto. I'm a jonin, and I have some experience with fighting in the mist. You can't expect that you'll win every battle at this point. You're fighting really well, much better than when we started, wouldn't you say, Han? He asked, turning to the approaching Iwa Nin. The steam user's gaze flickered between the pair of Jinchūriki, taking in the brunette's pointed look and Naruto's hopeful expression. You're still learning, he grunted flatly. Naruto beamed, internally translating Han's words to the same gruff, non-committal praise Rashi often uttered. Hell yeah, there's still more to do, Han continued. You, too, boy, he called to Gaara, who'd risen to his feet. Let's see what you two can do without interference. There's a problem that's just come to my attention which requires immediate action. Tsunade laced her fingers together and placed them under her nose, elbows resting on her desk. Uchiha Sasuke has left the village. He's likely being assisted by a retinue of shinobi handpicked by Orochimaru. That's why I've learned not to question Orochimaru's machinations. It's a safe bet to assume that, whatever the reason, it's to his interest, and therefore against Konoha's. Ultimately, it's irrelevant to the mission goal. The dark-haired boy before her, barely a teenager, stared at the blonde with narrowed brown eyes. I'm assuming you want Sasuke returned to the village. Given Orochimaru's reputation, it would be best to assemble a four-man squad of high-ranked Chunin and/or Jonin. That's not going to happen. Unfortunately, we still don't have the resources to spare. Then, with all due respect, Hokage-sama, why am I here? I heard about your performance in the Chunin exams. And what you did afterwards, during the invasion. There aren't many people who would make the decisions you made. Nara Shikamaru remained silent, aware that the Sannin hadn't finished her thought. I need you to gather as many genin as you can and return Sasuke to the village. I'm asking you to do this because I believe you're the only one who can see this mission through to a successful conclusion. There was a moment of hesitation, the Chunin seeming to weigh what he'd been asked, and then he nodded. Yes, Hokage-sama. You leave immediately. And if you're looking for recruits, she picked up a piece of paper laying on her desk and handed it to him. I have a recommendation. Brown eyes scanned the single sheaf. Hokage-sama, according to this, he's not even a genin. You're technically correct. But as you can see, his skills make him more than capable. Shikamaru's brow furrowed, though Tsunade didn't know the boy well enough to determine if it was out of annoyance, skepticism, or if he was just thinking. You can find him at the main Senju compound on the east side of town. Shikamaru sketched a bow to the blonde. If you say so, Hokage-sama. He turned and began to amble towards the door, stopping only at the call of his name. I've seen my fair share of shinobi sacrificing themselves for the sake of the mission, just like you did. Come back with the shinobi you left with, and that's a success in my books. I've already buried more than enough kids to last a lifetime. Shikamaru inclined his head in acknowledgement and left. That's it for part 5. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.